November 27th. 1887 began with Deputy United States Marshals riding out of Fort Smith toward the Arkansas River, and by evening Frank Dalton lay dead in the brush with his younger brothers staring at the body that ended their short belief that the badge alone could hold back the violence of Indian Territory. The air carried wood smoke from scattered farmhouses. The ground around the riverbank was churned by horses and streaked with dried mud, and the echo of the fight still hung over the water as other deputies gathered the fallen man for the trip back to town. Frank Dalton had set out that morning with a small posse to serve warrants on whiskey runners who used the river bottoms as a trail into the Cherokee and Creek nations. His pay as a deputy marshal was low. The risk was constant, and every man in the party understood that the outlaws they hunted had as much firepower as any officer of the court. Frank rode with the calm of a man who had already seen his share of gunfights, his Winchester carbine resting across his saddle and his revolver tied down at his thigh, while the younger men with him kept glancing at the thickets that lined the river road. Indian Territory in those years held broad stretches of open prairie that rolled into wooded creeks and river valleys, and the thin reach of federal law moved along those trails on horseback in the form of deputy marshals, court clerks, and jail guards. Towns were scattered far apart, rail lines cut through the grassland, and whiskey traders, horse thieves, and train robbers used the same routes that freight wagons and stagecoaches followed. On that November day, the riverbank where Frank Dalton died was quiet when the posse arrived, with only the rustle of wind in the cottonwoods and the low murmur of water over sandbars. The bushwhackers who waited for Frank Dalton had chosen their cover carefully, screening themselves behind fallen logs and saplings with open lanes of fire toward the approaching lawmen. As Frank called out for the suspects to surrender, rifles answered instead. The first volley dropped him from the saddle and wounded several of the men behind him. Horses reared and stumbled. One animal went down screaming on the wet ground, and for several minutes the fight was a close exchange of shots between officers who scrambled for dirt and timber and outlaws who knew that killing a deputy marshal meant a noose if they were taken alive. By the time the gunfire ended, Frank Dalton lay face down with several bullets through his body and his badge twisted in the dust near his hand. The surviving deputies pulled back, then returned when the ambushers slipped away into the river timber. They lifted Frank onto a blanket, carried him to a wagon, and rode slowly back to Fort Smith with his body. The news reached the Dalton family before the wagon did. Younger brothers Grat, Bob, and Emmett, who had known Indian Territory as home since childhood, now saw that the job their brother had chosen was as exposed as any outlaw trail. The funeral for Frank Dalton at Fort Smith brought deputy marshals, townspeople, and railroad men together in a crowded church where the coffin stood open at the front. The body had been washed and dressed in a plain suit instead of the trail-stained clothes he had worn into the gun battle, yet the marks of the bullets remained visible beneath the fabric at his chest. His mother and sisters stood near the head of the coffin while his brothers stood stiff near the back, listening to sermons that spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the harsh demands of law in a territory that had not yet reached statehood. For the Dalton brothers, the funeral did not close a chapter. It opened a path. Grat and Bob soon accepted work of the same kind that had killed Frank, taking commissions as Deputy United States Marshals working out of the federal court for Indian Territory. Emmett, still younger, started as a jail guard and later followed his brothers into field duty. They rode with other deputies under warrants signed at Fort Smith and at the court in Muskogee, following whiskey sellers, cattle thieves, and fugitive murderers into the hills and river country that had taken their brother's life. Deputy marshal work paid by the arrest, and payments came only when a prisoner was delivered to the court and entered on the docket. The deputies supplied their own horses, saddles, weapons, and provisions. When Grat or Bob Dalton left town with a pocket full of warrants, they knew that days or weeks might pass before any money came back, and that the costs of feed and ammunition would fall on them alone. Nights on the trail meant cold campfires, damp blankets, and the constant push to keep prisoners moving, often with irons on their ankles toward crowded jails that always smelled of sweat, mildew, and stale tobacco. The same family connections that helped the Daltons find support among local ranchers also raised suspicion among some lawmen and settlers. Their relatives and in-laws owned stock, ranched near important trails, and traded horses. In a region where branded animals moved freely across open range, arguments over ownership were common. When Dalton stock turned up far from its home pasture or when horses passed quickly from one hand to another, rumors spread along saloon counters and over corral fences that deputy marshals from the same family were blending honest work with quiet theft. Great and Bob spent long stretches riding with posses that combined federal deputies, tribal officers, and local men from the Cherokee and Creek nations. These men spoke many languages and carried many grudges. Some were full-blood citizens of the tribes tasked with protecting their own nations from whiskey and cattle theft. Others were white or mixed-blood men who had married into tribal families or leased land. The Daltons joined them in raids on hidden stills, in late-night approaches to cabins where suspects slept, and in long drags of prisoners back to court under harsh weather that chilled every rider on the trail. The strain of this work began to show in small ways. Bob Dalton, who had once carried himself with a steady manner in town, developed a short temper when questioned on his methods. He argued with court clerks over fees, snapped at jailers over the treatment of prisoners he had brought in, and clashed with other deputies who thought he cut corners on paperwork. Emmett, who admired his older brothers, noticed how openly Bob spoke of the small financial reward compared to the danger of facing armed criminals in lonely country, and how often the talk around their kitchen table turned to money. Horseflesh stood at the center of most fortunes in that part of Indian Territory. Farmers depended on teams to pull plows and wagons, ranchers needed string after string of saddle horses for their cowhands, and freight outfits bought sturdy animals in groups. A man who traded horses often moved in a gray area between legitimate commerce and outright theft. As 1889 and 1890 began to change the land with new settlers and traffic linked to the land openings to the west, missing stock brought tempers close to the surface. When Dalton brothers appeared in the same circles as accused horse thieves, suspicion sharpened. The first serious accusations against the Daltons as horse thieves came from ranchers who claimed that animals branded in their names had been driven away and resold. Complaints went to tribal courts and to the federal authorities. The same men who had watched Grat and Bob ride out in service of warrants now read letters that linked their names to stolen property. Investigations began. Deputy marshals who had once shared campfires with the Daltons interviewed witnesses and collected statements. The air in the marshal's office grew tense when their names appeared in reports, and muttered comments followed them along the halls of the courthouse. Official charges followed. Great and Bob Dalton faced indictments for horse theft, and Emmett found himself questioned sharply on his own dealings. The cases did not move quickly, but they did change how the brothers walked through town. Where they had once moved easily from the marshal's office to the livery stable and the saloons, they now felt eyes following them. Men who had spoken freely to them before now kept their conversations short. Some ranchers refused to do business with them. The Daltons, who had once been held up as examples of young officers willing to risk their lives in a rough district, now carried a shadow over every step. The federal court that oversaw Indian Territory demanded that its deputies stay clear of the appearance of corruption, yet it had few ways to police their behavior in distant settlements. When word reached judges and court officials that officers under indictment continued to wear badges and carry warrants, the matter could not be ignored. Meetings were held, and the Daltons found that requests for new commissions went unanswered. Pay stopped arriving. The boundaries between their official duties and the accusations that stained their names collapsed in a slow but certain way that everyone around them could see. The withdrawal of official support pushed the brothers back toward the family homestead and the network of friends and kin who still trusted them. On visits to their mother's place, they sat at a rough kitchen table where the lamplight showed worry in her face while they spoke in low voices on the charges and the debt that had piled up. Saddles, tack, and even firearms had been bought on credit. Horses had been borrowed or leased. Without steady deputy pay, every piece of their outfit represented someone else's money. That pressure weighed most heavily on Bob Dalton, who had grown used to thinking of himself as a leader. Conversations that once revolved around court sessions and upcoming warrants began to turn to other subjects. The brothers and their close associates discussed the railroads that crossed Indian territory and the shipments of cash and valuables that moved by train. They knew every stop, every water tank, every siding where a train slowed. Their knowledge came from years spent guarding those very lines as deputies, escorting prisoners by rail, or riding in the express car while messengers handled registered packages. That experience now sat in their minds without an official outlet and without a legal way to turn it into income. Tension inside the Dalton family grew as some members urged the brothers to clear their names and return to lawful work, while others focused on survival. The younger men resented the idea of backing down in the face of accusations they insisted were false. At the same time, creditors pressed for payment, and the cost of living remained relentless. Every sack of flour, every new set of horseshoes, and every doctor's visit for relatives had to be covered. The badges that once brought respect no longer carried weight in the face of overdue accounts and a court system that had turned its attention elsewhere. By early 1891, the path that had begun with Frank Dalton's body on a wagon out of the river bottoms had led his younger brothers into a corner. Their work for the federal court had placed them in constant danger without providing the security they had once imagined. Suspicion from both ranchers and other officers had stripped away much of their standing. Indictments for horse theft stained their names and cut them off from further official duty. Surrounded by debt, carrying hard-earned knowledge of trails, trains, and the habits of armed men on both sides of the law, the Dalton brothers stood on the edge of a choice that would soon pull them out of the marshal's service and into open outlawry. February 6, 1891 settled over the San Joaquin Valley with cold air and low clouds as a Southern Pacific passenger train rolled south toward the small station at Alila in Tulare County. The cars rattled over the rails, lanterns swayed in the coaches, and coal smoke pressed against closed windows, while farmers along the line banked their kitchen stoves and wind tugged at unpainted barns. Inside, the train passengers shifted in their seats and dozed, unaware that horsemen watched the headlight from the dark edges of the fields and matched their own movements to the slow beat of steel wheels on jointed track. A short distance ahead of the locomotive, two men waited beside the right-of-way with their horses tied back from the gravel shoulder. Each man wore a mask and carried a large-caliber revolver. Behind them lay open country broken by irrigation ditches and low windbreaks of trees, with scattered farmhouses set back from the rails. The night carried only the usual sounds of the valley, the distant bark of dogs and the faint rush of water in ditches, until the growing glare of the headlight washed over steel and gravel and threw hard shadows behind fence posts. The engineer saw figures swing lanterns and raised arms and brought his train to a halt. Steam blew around the running gear and the air filled with the hiss of valves and the smell of hot iron. The masked men clambered onto the engine, ordered the engineer and firemen down at gunpoint, and marched them along the side of the train toward the express car. Passengers, jolted awake by the sudden stop, peered through the glass and muttered questions, but stayed in their seats when a third figure fired warning shots along the length of the coaches to keep curious men from stepping onto the platforms. At the express car, the messengers inside held revolvers and shotguns and kept the door barred. The robbers forced the engineer to stand in front of the door and pound on the panels, shouting to be let in. He stood as a living shield, framed in lamplight, while mask cloth and gun barrels loomed behind his shoulders. Inside, the men of the express company saw only shapes and heard only shouted orders through the wood and iron of the door. They answered with gunfire, shooting toward the figures outside in the belief that they were hitting the men who threatened the train. The first round struck the engineer. Bullets tore into the man who had worked the throttle and brake on that stretch of line through countless trips. He dropped in the dust beside the rails, wounded in the stomach and bleeding heavily. The fireman watched his partner fall and could do nothing. The headlight cast hard light across the scene, showing steam drifting around the cylinders, the wounded man on the ground, and the masked figures jerking back from the door as splinters flew. The express messengers, hearing no clear reply from outside, kept firing until trainmen shouted for them to stop. When the door finally opened, the outlaws had already moved away into the dark. They had not reached the money behind the walls and inner safe of the car. Their plan had yielded only a wounded railroad man and a train full of shaken passengers who would carry word of the holdup to the next town. In the lantern light of that station, telegraph keys began to click, sending messages up and down the line that a Southern Pacific passenger train had been stopped near Alila by masked men who escaped before they could be identified. Tulare County Sheriff Gene Kay took charge of the response. He and his deputies rode to the site, examined boot tracks and hoof marks in the gravel, and talked with crew members and passengers. Railroad detectives joined them, men used to following robberies along distant stretches of track and reading small signs at crime scenes. A broken strap at the holdup site matched leather on a saddle at Bill Dalton's place. Reports from Tulare, Fresno, and other valley towns placed Bob and Emmett Dalton along the route of the pay car in the days before the holdup, lingering near depots and saloons where railroad men gathered after payday. For months before the robbery, Bob and Emmett had moved through the valley, spending nights in cheap rooms, gambling in loud card rooms, and riding with their brothers to follow the Southern Pacific pay car as it carried wages south from Oakland. Bill farmed wheat and tended stock on land near San Miguel and Paso Robles, and his younger brothers used his ranch as a base between trips. They rode north to meet the pay car at one town, then drifted along the same path as it stopped at others, watching the flow of currency and the habits of guards and train crews. The Alila holdup turned those habits against them. On March 17th, a Tulare County grand jury returned indictments charging Bob, Emmett, Gratt, and Bill Dalton with participation in the crime near Alila. The papers named each man, listed the date and place of the attempted robbery, and passed the case from rumor into formal accusation. Wells Fargo and the Southern Pacific added their influence, helping to post rewards, circulate descriptions, and press for vigorous pursuit of the brothers whose name already carried weight in Indian territory. By the time the indictments came down, Bob and Emmett were gone. With Bill's help, they had secured horses, food, weapons, and cash and left California behind. Sheriff Kay tracked them through the Mojave country, following sign where he could find it, and collecting information from section hands, ranchers, and station agents. At Ludlow, horses known to belong to the Daltons were discovered, confirming that the fugitives had passed that way. The trail then crossed desert and reached Utah, where the brothers used the railroad itself to jump ahead of the posse, boarding trains under assumed names and slipping away before officers could close in. Kay spent weeks on the chase, moving from one dry station to the next, but distance and lack of solid leads finally forced him back to his primary duties in Tulare County. Bob and Emmett continued eastward, drawing steadily closer to the family home country near Kingfisher in the newly formed Oklahoma Territory. There, friends and relatives could provide shelter, fresh horses, and a better understanding of local trails than any pursuer from another state could gain in a short time. By the time California officers turned their full attention back to the courtroom, the two younger Daltons had rejoined their kin on the plains. In Visalia, Grate remained in a cell while his trial moved forward. Bill sold stock, mortgaged property, and hired an attorney of high reputation in the valley to defend his brother. Their mother traveled west with several of her children and sat through long days in court as witnesses testified on movements, conversations, and sightings from the winter nights around the Alila event. Despite testimony that placed Grate in Fresno at the time of the robbery, the power of the railroad company and the climate of anger over the wounded engineer weighed heavily. During the summer, a jury convicted Grate, and the court prepared to send him to state prison. The Tulare County jail that held him was of recent construction, brick walls and iron bars replacing earlier crude structures. Prisoners slept in narrow bunks, passed time in cramped corridors, and learned the routines of guards who checked cells at regular intervals. During September, small changes crept into that routine. A heavy wooden box appeared near one section of bars inside the cell block. Songs and card games ran later into the night, and conversations lowered in tone when deputies drew near. No single detail stood out to casual visitors, but the pattern masked deliberate work. On the night of September 27th, while Sheriff Kay was away, that work reached its result. Behind the wooden box, inmates had used a smuggled saw to cut through one of the vertical iron bars. They filled the growing gap with soap and soot between sessions, hiding the progress from casual inspection. That night, the bar came free. Grate and two fellow prisoners slipped through the opening, moved quietly along the corridor, and reached the jail's lower rooms. There they forced an outer grating and stepped into the darkness beyond the walls, leaving behind only a broom handle blackened with soot wedged where iron had once stood. By morning, alarms spread through the town. Deputies and hastily assembled posses searched alleys, barns, and the country roads east toward the Sierra foothills. One of the escaped men was recaptured. Grate remained at large. Reports later placed him along the Kings River and in the rough terrain above Sanger, using steep slopes, heavy brush, and the protection of sympathizers to stay just ahead of searching parties. From there, he worked his way out of the valley entirely and began a long journey back toward familiar ground near Kingfisher, moving by night and staying in isolated cabins when he could find them. While California officers concentrated on a missing prisoner, events in Oklahoma Territory pushed the Dalton story into a new phase. Bob and Emmett reached their mother's home and reconnected with men who had grown up with them on ranches and small farms. They met around kitchen tables and in dim lamplight of bunkhouses, speaking in low tones on the Alila case, the indictments, and the cost of defense lawyers for Grate. The railroad companies in Wells Fargo now offered a reward of $3,600 for their capture, a sum greater than many families in the district could hope to see in ready cash at one time. Faced with that pressure and the need for large sums of money, Bob focused his plans on the railroads that crossed the territory. He knew the schedules, the isolated stretches of track, and the way express shipments moved under guard. Among the men who gathered around him were George Newcomb, called Bitter Creek, and Charlie Bryant, known as Black-Faced because of an old powder burn. They were joined by riders such as Bill Doolin, Charlie Pierce, and Dick Broadwell, men accustomed to long days in the saddle, rough camps, and direct violence. In these meetings, held at remote ranches and in hidden camps along creeks, the talk circled again and again to trains. The men spread timetables on tables or on the ground, noted grades and sidings, and discussed which stretches of line offered the best combination of cover and delay. They paid attention to where telegraph lines ran close to the track, knowing that a quick warning could bring posses from several directions at once. Out of this planning came a decision to strike a train of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe near a small station named Wharton in the northern part of the territory. On a night in May 1891, the gang put that decision into action. The prairie lay under thin starlight and a restless wind that moved the grass in long ripples. The men waited beside the line near Wharton, horses ground tied in a shallow draw that hid them from the track. When the Santa Fe train approached, its headlight glowed low on the horizon, growing steadily until it threw white light over the waiting figures. The outlaws stepped into view with rifles and revolvers ready and signaled the engineer to stop. The train ground to a halt, steam rolling from the cylinders. The crew climbed down under the threat of drawn guns. Bob and his partners moved with hard efficiency, keeping the locomotive crew together under guard while other men went to the express car. The messenger inside opened his door under the muzzles of several weapons and faced men who knew exactly what they wanted. They forced him to open his safe and hand over cash and valuables that could be carried quickly in sacks and saddlebags. Papers and drafts with no immediate use to them were pushed aside. Within a short time, the gang led the crew back to the Hughes cars, warned them to stay put, and mounted their horses. The escape from Wharton showed the value of their planning. They turned off the main trail, moving in single file through draws and across open stretches where no farmhouses stood. By morning, they had reached country where friends waited with food and fresh mounts. News of the robbery spread by telegraph and word of mouth. Law officers in the territory recognized that a new train band had taken the field, one composed of men with local knowledge and no hesitation toward pointing guns at railroad employees. Attention soon shifted toward the men around Bob. That summer, Deputy Marshal Ed Short received word that Charlie Bryant had been seen in the town of Hennessy after leaving the gang's hideout to visit his mother. Short arrested Bryant and placed him on a train to Wichita without notifying other officers or arranging for an escort. On the run between Hennessy and Wakamis, Bryant recovered a revolver carelessly stored by the baggage man, confronted Short on the rear platform, and shot him in the back. Short returned fire and both men died, their bodies found after the train stopped. The incident underscored the deadly character of the men now grouped around the Dalton name. Despite that loss, the gang gathered again and planned another holdup. Their second target in the territory lay on the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas line near a small station named Lelietta, a few miles north of Wagoner. The site offered a depot, a siding, and enough open approaches for mounted men to control the ground under cover of darkness. On the night of September 15, 1891, they brought the train to a halt there and repeated the pattern that had worked at Wharton, taking positions that covered the crew and moving on the express car with weapons drawn. The work at Lelietta took longer. The messenger resisted, buying time while he assessed the number of attackers and the depth of their resolve. The outlaws held their ground, kept their guns steady, and forced their way into the car. When the safe finally opened, they pulled out a heavy take in currency and valuables, leaving behind documents that meant nothing to them at that moment. Gunfire during the raid wounded bystanders near the depot, including men who had stepped out to see what the commotion along the track meant, showing how easily a planned robbery could send stray bullets into unarmed townspeople. The money from Lelietta produced internal strain even as it gave the gang resources. Some members felt that Bob favored his own needs and certain companions when shares were counted. Bill Doolin and others complained openly on inequities in the division. Arguments at campsites and ranch houses grew sharper as the months turned, and men who had once ridden out together in close agreement now measured one another with cooler eyes. Yet the record of the year stood clear. In the span of months, trains had been halted at Wharton and Lelietta, officers and bystanders had been killed or wounded, and the Dalton name had become fixed in the public mind as a symbol of organized train robbery across the territory. Early 1892 to late summer 1892. Winter passed over Oklahoma Territory with hard winds that scraped along the prairie and settled dust against every fence line and shack. In that season, the men now recognized as the Dalton Gang shifted between dugout hideouts, ranch houses of trusted friends, and brushy camps along creeks that fed the Arkansas and Cimarron rivers. Saddles stayed on near every hour of daylight. Rifles lay within reach of bedrolls, and someone always stood watch in the dark while the others slept. Their names carried wanted notices in several jurisdictions, yet in the scattered settlements of the territory they still had relatives, schoolyard friends, and former neighbors willing to put them up and keep silent when deputy marshals rode through. Bob Dalton took the central place in this loose band. The younger outlaws around him watched how he studied maps, timetables, and the ground around rail lines. He had served as a lawman, had ridden with posses that chased thieves along these same tracks, and now he turned that experience toward planning robberies. Grat, older and heavier set, handled part of the routine work of keeping the men supplied. Emmett, still not far from his early 20s, rode at Bob's side often and saw every detail of how the older brother weighed risk and chose targets. Men such as Bill Doolin, George Newcomb, Charlie Pierce, and Dick Broadwell tied their horses and rolled out blankets in those camps as the year turned. The law did not stand still in response. Deputy Marshals Heck Thomas, Chris Madsen, and Bill Tillman, who had already earned reputations as relentless hunters of fugitives, tightened their net in Indian Territory. They rode with Cherokee and Creek officers, visited ranches where sympathizers might shelter train robbers, and spent long days following tracks in the sand near waterholes and river crossings. When they stopped at line camps, they questioned cowhands on strangers who had passed through. Telegraph operators along the Santa Fe and Missouri, Kansas, and Texas lines received descriptions of Dalton riders and instructions to report any sightings. The gang learned that these 3 deputies carried their names in pocket notebooks and spoke of them in every town they passed through. Inside the camps, the robberies already completed had changed the tone of conversations. At Wharton and Lelietta, the gang had proven that they could halt trains, dominate crews, and strip express safes under the threat of gunfire. These jobs had sent money into their pockets, but they had also taken lives. The killing of Deputy Marshal Ed Short on the train from Hennessy and the deaths of Bryant and bystanders near earlier raids weighed differently on the men. Some spoke of them only as costs of the work, while others studied the ground in silence when names of the dead arose. Discord over how money had been divided at Lelietta lingered, yet the prospect of new hauls kept the group together. The gang adjusted tactics as they prepared for further strikes. Masks and neckerchiefs stayed in saddlebags, but riders now carried spare cartridges in belts arranged carefully before each job. They studied how quickly telegraph operators could send warnings and began to plan for control of depots and stations as carefully as they planned the rush on express cars. They noted which towns held large stock pens and busy sidings, knowing that in such places more armed men might be awake at any hour. Smaller stations with few residents but enough facilities for a stop rose higher on the list of potential sites. Red Rock stood along the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line north of Guthrie. The station sat near open prairie broken only by low rises and scattered scrub. A water tank, sidetrack, and small depot building marked the place. Nearby lay a store, corrals, and a handful of houses that turned their windows toward the tracks, since trains brought mail, freight, and news. Before choosing it as the scene for another robbery, Bob and several of the men rode through on ordinary days, wearing plain ranch clothes and leading pack animals that carried nothing more suspicious than feed and a few tools. They watched the timing of trains, saw how the station agent stepped out to meet each one, and counted how many men appeared on the platform. By early summer 1892, the planning reached its final shape. The gang chose a northbound passenger train that routinely carried an express car believed to hold significant commercial shipments. They agreed on hand signals, positions, and the order in which each man would move once the engineer brought his locomotive to a halt. Horses were cached in a shallow draw west of the station where mesquite and grass offered cover. Guns were checked again and again in the hours before the train's arrival. Men smoked in short pulls and let the cigarette ends fall into sand they had already scuffed with their boots to erase marks. When the chosen train's headlight finally showed on the southern horizon, the gang mounted and let their horses walk toward the rails. The hum of steel on rail grew into a full roar as the locomotive closed the distance. Bob stepped into view near the track with rifle in hand, swinging it in a way that signaled trouble ahead. The engineer, facing the responsibility for every life aboard, pulled the throttle back and applied the brakes. Steel shrieked, dust and cinders flew out from under the wheels, and the train came to a grinding stop near the depot. The first seconds after the wheels stopped turning belonged entirely to the gang. Men flowed up along both sides of the train, shouting orders for passengers to stay inside, cutting off potential resistance by pointing muzzles at open coach doors. At the depot, another pair of riders ordered the station agent away from his telegraph key and made him step out with his hands high. Bob and one companion moved directly to the express car, where the messenger inside had already sensed danger and reached for his shotgun. The outlaws shouted their identity and made clear that any attempt to fire would lead to death on the spot. Faced with several rifles and revolvers trained on him, the express messenger came to the door under duress. Bob ordered him to step down and walk ahead to the safe. The others kept weapons centered on the man's chest and shoulders while he turned combination dials with shaking fingers. Inside the car, lamplight threw sharp shadows across stacked crates, sealed packages, and the heavy iron door of the safe. When the bolts finally clicked open, Bob forced the messenger back while his partner swung the door out and reached for bags and parcels marked with express company stamps that signaled cash shipments. Bundles of currency passed quickly from the safe to grain sacks brought for the purpose. Smaller packages, letters, and documents slid aside under the boots of the raiders, their contents of no immediate value. Jewelry cases and other compact items with high worth slipped into coat pockets and saddlebags. Outside, men kept the crew and any visible passengers covered. Occasional shouts from frightened travelers filtered through windows, but no organized resistance formed in that short period. The work remained sharp and controlled, measured in minutes rather than in any longer span. Once the sacks carried all the cash the robbers could manage on horseback, Bob signaled the withdrawal. The men backed away from the train, still aiming weapons at the figures on the ground. One outlaw fired several shots into the air to discourage anyone from following too closely. The riders swung into their saddles and turned toward the shallow draw where fresh mounts waited. As they disappeared into the prairie darkness, the engineer and conductor watched from beside the tracks, knowing that telegraph keys would soon carry the story of what had just taken place to every division point along the line. In the hours that followed, Red Rock buzzed with activity. Station agents sent messages detailing the stoppage, the number of masked men, and the direction they had ridden. Posse calls went out from towns in both Oklahoma and Indian Territory. Deputy marshals and railroad detectives, saddled in haste, gathered local volunteers and set out along likely escape routes. They found trampled grass and scattered signs where the gang had shifted to fresh horses, but the outlaws had already used their head start and knowledge of the land to put distance between themselves and any organized pursuit. The success at Red Rock hardened the position of the Dalton gang in the minds of both law officers and ordinary citizens. Newspapers took note and printed accounts that carried the story to states far from the territory. The public read names such as Bob and Grat Dalton and attached them to phrases like train robbers and desperados. The gang felt this change in every settlement, where they tried to buy ammunition or food under assumed names. Glances lasted longer. Conversations stopped when strangers stepped inside. The men understood that reputation could guard them as well as threaten them, since some people would now hesitate to confront a group that had proven willing to point guns at a moving train. The gang did not remain idle. After Red Rock, they looked toward the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas line in the Cherokee Nation. Adair, a small town along that route, offered a depot, a siding and nearby timber where horses and men could stay hidden until needed. The tracks there ran close to the street with a handful of businesses and houses close enough that any disturbance would draw eyes from doors and windows. Despite the risk of more witnesses, Bob chose it because the train they wished to strike stopped there regularly, and because the terrain allowed several exit paths once the job was done. In the days leading up to the Adair job, gang members drifted into the area separately. One rode in as a cattle buyer, spending time at stables and corrals. Another took a room at a rudimentary hotel and drank at the local saloon, listening for mention of deputy marshals or soldiers passing through. The telegraph operator at the depot, a young man accustomed to routine freight messages and occasional personal wires, saw no clear pattern in the comings and goings of strangers who paid in coin and kept their voices low. At night, the gang met at a secluded camp, reviewing their plan in the light of a small fire shielded from town by low hills. When the chosen night came, heavy clouds covered the sky and cut the moonlight. The gang moved into position with horses kept to a walk until they stood near the depot and tracks. Riders detailed to control the telegraph office dismounted and approached the building quietly. One stepped inside, pushed the muzzle of his revolver into the operator's back and ordered him away from the key. Another cut the telegraph wire outside, ensuring that no message would go out during the next minutes. Bob and several others waited near the point where the locomotive would come to a halt. The train rolled into Adair with steam drifting along its sides and sparks snapping from the stack. When it stopped, the conductor stepped down, only to face several armed men who ordered him to stay still and keep his crew in hand. The express car once again drew the main focus. Its messenger, used to news of robberies on distant lines, now faced the reality of masked men on the ground outside his door. Shots fired into the air and shouted commands left him little room to maneuver. Under threat of immediate death, he opened his door and stood aside while Bob and his partners entered. Inside the express car, lamps lit stacks of freight and the iron front of another safe. The messenger worked the combination under a gun barrel pressed near his face. Outside, other members of the gang watched the length of the train. That night, certain passengers included doctors and officials returning from duty. Some of these men carried weapons and stepped toward windows or platforms despite orders to remain inside. When one raised a gun and tried to gain a clear shot along the train, an outlaw fired toward him. The bullet passed through glass and wood with enough force to strike a man seated within, driving splinters and lead into flesh. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Shots from the train flashed along the coach line while outlaws beside the depot answered with their own rifles. In this close exchange, a doctor received a fatal wound, another man suffered a serious injury, and passengers who had only expected a routine journey suddenly found themselves lying flat on car floors, hearing bullets punch through window frames and seats. Outside, horses pulled reins taut, as nervous animals sensed the noise and smell of powder. The switch lamps near the siding cast dim light across figures that darted from shadow to shadow. Despite this burst of fighting, the express safe still opened under duress. The robbers filled sacks with currency and other valuables, then ordered the messenger to stay inside and keep his hands away from any weapons. Bob shouted for his men to pull back. They moved away from the train in a crouch, firing a last series of shots to discourage pursuit. The wounded were left aboard, tended by their fellow passengers and the surviving doctor, while the outlaws mounted and rode into the darkness beyond the circle of town lights. Pursuit again followed, this time with an edge sharpened by civilian casualties. Deputy marshals and Cherokee officers organized posses, and railroad detectives arrived to study the Adair scene. They cataloged shells, measured footprints, and interviewed witnesses who described the number of men and the way they had spoken and moved. Doctors from the region examined the bodies and injuries, providing details that were passed along in official reports. Rewards for the capture of the Dalton gang and its associates rose still higher, reflecting the anger of both the railroads and communities that now faced not only theft, but the death of non-combatants. Within the gang, the Adair raid deepened existing tensions. Some complained that the firefight near the coaches had been unnecessary, and that it increased the ferocity of the response from law officers. Others argued that armed men on the train had forced their hand, and that once bullets started flying, survival outweighed every other concern. Arguments over leadership, over the future targets to be chosen, and over whether to remain together or split into smaller bands ran late into the night at camps in the brushy draws and canyons where they sheltered after Adair. Through that summer, the Dalton gang moved constantly, staying ahead of posses yet feeling the pressure close in. Towns posted handbills with their likenesses. Newspapers reprinted those images so that readers in distant cities now recognized the faces of Bob, Grat, and Emmett, along with several of their partners. Railroads invested more money into guards and into private detectives who specialized in long pursuit. The gang's successes at Red Rock and Adair had shown how much damage a small band of determined men could inflict on large companies and communities. Those same successes convinced Bob that if he wished to secure a sum that could end his fugitive life and pay for the legal struggles of his family, it would require a single blow greater than any train job they had yet attempted. Late in the summer of 1892, the heat in the northern part of Indian Territory pressed down on every draw and river bend, yet for the men around Bob Dalton, the air felt tight for reasons that had nothing to do with weather. Posters nailed to depot walls and courthouse doors offered $40,000 for delivery of the train robbers who had struck at Red Rock and Adair. Smaller rewards from express companies and county authorities stacked on top of that figure. In towns along the Santa Fe and Missouri, Kansas, and Texas lines, shopkeepers and section hands read those notices and repeated the names printed in large letters, fixing the Dalton gang as targets whose capture could wipe away years of debt for whoever brought them in. The gang that gathered that season did not look like the larger company that had formed a year earlier. Bitter Creek Newcomb, Bill Doolin, and Charlie Pierce had broken away after the division of money from Lelietta, and later jobs left bitter remarks hanging in the air. Those evenings had ended with banked campfires, cold coffee and tin cups, and men staring in different directions while Bob and Doolin fought over figures. By August, the splintering was complete. Doolin and his followers drifted toward other hideouts, leaving behind talk that Bob squandered money in saloons and rooms where card games never stopped. What remained around Bob were Grat, Emmett, Dick Broadwell, and a Missourian named Bill Powers, leaner in number but bound tightly to their leader's plans. Pressure from the law came from more than one direction. Deputy Marshals Heck Thomas, Chris Madsen, and Bill Tillman had turned train robbery into their personal campaign. They knew some of the Dalton family from earlier years and treated the pursuit as a matter of professional pride. They spoke to ranchers who had once sheltered the brothers, followed their tracks into cedar breaks along the Canadian, and sat in dim hotel lobbies listening for loose talk on where the gang had last been seen. Railroad detectives watched the same territory with private lists of informants. Every layover in a frontier town now carried a risk that some man in dusty overalls or a clerk with ink on his fingers would step outside and quietly point law officers toward any stranger who fit the growing descriptions. In that setting, the train lines lost their appeal for Bob. Recent robberies had produced heavy stacks of drafts and securities that could not be spent without risk. And once those papers were discarded, the remaining cash share shrank. Armed guards rode more trains, companies moved wealth with extra care, and lines of steel and telegraph wire tied towns together in ways that made each raid harder to carry out without prompt pursuit. Bob began to talk less of schedules and sidings and more of permanent buildings with vaults set in brick walls and stone foundations. Banks did not move, and in smaller towns their security still depended on counters, locks, and the courage of a few men rather than detachments of professional guards. Out of that shift came a sentence that stuck with everyone who heard it. Bob said that he would surpass anything the James brothers had tried, and that he would do it by robbing 2 banks in one stroke in daylight so that every newspaper would print the story. He chose his words in camp one night while the light from a small fire glowed on his face, and the others sat on their heels or on upturned saddles listening. He did not propose an unknown town. Instead, he named Coffeyville, Kansas, a place that had once been close to home ground for the family, a town where their parents had lived near Robbins Corners and where people still remembered them as boys. The choice cut across common outlaw practice. Most bands avoided places where their faces had been known in ordinary life. Emmett was the first to say so. He reminded his brother that former classmates and neighbors lived there, that clerks and merchants had seen him on errands and at gatherings when he was younger, and that those people would recognize his build and manner even if he wore a beard or new hat. He stated plainly that any real fight in Coffeyville would not just involve faceless lawmen. It would risk killing men whose hands had once rested on the same church pews as the Dalton family. Bob brushed those warnings aside with a tight jaw and a fixed stare into the fire. He argued that familiarity could work in their favor because they knew every path from the town square to the outskirts, every alley behind the main buildings, and the quickest way to reach the crossings that led back toward Indian Territory. They had visited Coffeyville when freight wagons still cut deep ruts in its streets. They had seen the brick front of the C.M. Condon and Company Bank rise near Walnut Street and the First National Bank stand on the opposite side of the plaza. To Bob, that arrangement offered a chance for a feat that would shake the region. Both institutions struck in a single rush. 2 vaults opened before anyone outside could organize a defense. Planning began with the composition of the raiding party. The gang could no longer call on a dozen riders. Bob settled on 5 men. He placed himself at the center with Grat and Emmett as the family core, and added Broadwell and Powers, who had not grown up in Coffeyville and would be unknown to its residents. Their roles formed quickly in his mind. He and Emmett would take the First National Bank. Great, Broadwell, and Powers would handle the Condon Bank. The distance between these buildings could be crossed in a few strides, letting the 2 groups support each other once the safes were open and the money sacked. They next worked through the escape route. Bob remembered a hitching rail behind the Condon Bank that stood close to a rear entrance and out of direct view from the plaza. In his plan, the gang would ride in from the west, turn down 8th Street, pass along the back of the buildings, and tie their horses to that rail. From there, they could walk into the banks on foot, carrying rifles close along their legs to keep them from drawing attention too soon. After the safes were opened and the money secured, the men from both banks would converge, use hostages as partial shields along the edge of the plaza, reach the rail, mount in one movement, and ride straight back the way they had entered. Weapons and ammunition came under equal scrutiny. Each man already carried a Winchester repeating rifle and a Colt revolver, but the condition of those arms varied after long months on the trail. Early in September, they tested each gun at improvised targets, patching splintered stocks, tightening screws, and discarding worn cartridge belts in favor of new leather that would not break at a critical instant. brass shells left in the dust under cottonwoods near a creek bed marked where they checked that the extractors in their rifles pulled every spent casing cleanly. No one wanted to ride into a bank lobby with a weapon that could jam on its first shot. Clothing and appearance required more thought than usual because of the location. Coffeyville residents knew the Dalton brothers' faces from the years when those men had worked as cowhands and farm laborers and had walked its streets without trying to hide. To cut across that memory, Bob ordered that they all wear fresh coats, shirts, and hats picked up in towns where they passed through as anonymous buyers. 2 of them would wear false beards and wigs fashioned with enough care to survive a fast ride and the heat of a nervous morning. The others would shave carefully and keep their hair trimmed short, hoping the combination of distance, altered clothes, and the bustle of a business day would keep recognition from coming too fast. Information on Coffeyville's current shape came from more than the gang's old recollections. During those weeks, quietly carried newspapers and chance conversations filled in details on new sidewalks, recent construction, and changes in local businesses. The Daltons learned that Isham Brothers and Mansour Hardware still stood near the heart of town, that A.P. Boswell's hardware store handled a steady flow of firearms and tools, and that other merchants lined the same streets in close ranks. First National served farmers, ranchers, and merchants, while the Condon Bank handled deposits and loans tied to the commerce that moved through the town by rail and wagon. The presence of 2 banks in such close proximity confirmed Bob's belief that a single stroke there could produce a haul large enough to fund escape to distant territory. At the same time, these details carried warnings that Emmett did not ignore. Hardware stores close to the banks meant ready access to rifles and shotguns for any citizen willing to stand in a doorway and fire. The compact layout of the streets created clear lines of fire toward both bank fronts from upper floor windows. The gang discussed these points night after night. Bob insisted that speed would prevent those threats from maturing. His picture of the raid depended on moving inside, forcing cashiers and tellers to open safes without delay, filling sacks and walking back out before anyone on the street fully registered what was happening inside. In the last weeks before October, the gang drew closer to the Kansas line and spent more time in the country north of the Arkansas River. They stayed on small farms sympathetic to their cause, in line camps where cowhands turned their eyes downward rather than ask questions, and in shallow draws where blackjack oaks and grass hid bedrolls from trails. They traveled by night when crossing open stretches and kept to creek beds and low ridges by day, always aware that posses or railroad detectives might still be searching for men who had robbed trains only months before. Emmett's unease deepened as the date for the raid neared. He cleaned his revolver and Winchester with the same care as the others, rubbed oil into leather gear, and checked the stitching on his saddle. Yet whenever the talk returned to Coffeyville, he became blunt and direct. He pointed out that their mother had once shopped in that town, that brothers and sisters had walked into its stores, and that the people there did not see the Daltons only as names in handbills, but as members of a local family whose history stretched back over years. He pressed again for a different target, perhaps a bank in a town where no one had any personal link to them. The arguments between the brothers grew sharper. Bob listened with tight shoulders, then answered from a different place inside himself. He felt the weight of charges in California, the warrants in Indian Territory, and the growing reward sums that turned every man with a gun into a potential bounty hunter. He had already seen the gang shrink as Doolin and others chose their own paths. In his mind, there remained one way to break out of the tightening ring, strike a town whose layout he knew thoroughly, whose banks stood almost facing one another, and whose distance from major garrisons gave them a narrow window to escape back into territory ranch country before organized forces could arrive. As September closed, preparations took on a set pattern. The men left certain items behind with trusted friends, including extra clothing, tools, and some horses considered too distinctive to ride into such a highly visible crime. They set aside grain sacks that would be used for currency, selecting strong weave that would not split under weight. They checked saddle cinches for worn stitching, mended torn bedrolls, and packed food that could be eaten quickly and without fire. Camp conversations turned less toward random stories from earlier years and more toward exact sequences of action for the coming raid. Which door each man would use, where they would stand inside the banks, how they would speak to the bank officers, and how they would react if any citizen outside reached for a gun. Early in October, they moved into position near Coffeyville itself. The country there rolled gently with patches of timber in the low places and cultivated fields closer to town. Smoke from household chimneys and the sound of distant train whistles marked the presence of a community that had grown since the Daltons had last lived nearby. Rather than riding straight in, the gang skirted the edges of settled land and found a camping place along a creek west of town, where the banks rose just enough to hide their horses and bedrolls from any rider on upland roads. That camp on the night of October 4th held 5 men in the gear for a single decisive attempt. Saddles rested on the ground beside each animal, rifles leaned within reach against small trees, and bedrolls lay open while the group ate. Light came only from a controlled fire covered by a coffee pot and surrounded by stones that choked its glow. Conversation ran low. Bob kept a folded scrap of paper on his knee, a rough sketch of Coffeyville's central streets with marks for the 2 banks, the alley behind them, and the paths back toward the country from which they had come. Great moved a little apart from the others, checking his ammunition with thick fingers that had once handled branding irons and now counted cartridges into loops on his belt. Broadwell leaned back against a saddle, staring upward where the sky showed between tree branches while his hand rested over the butt of his revolver. Powers sat with his hat pushed back, face turned toward the sound of the creek flowing over stones as if measuring how clearly that noise might mask the sounds of men at work. Emmett, close to the fire, watched his brothers' faces one by one, searching for any sign that the plan might be postponed or altered, and finding none. In that still pocket of land west of Coffeyville, final choices hardened into shape. The men would ride in after sunrise, take the route Bob had laid out along 8th Street, leave their horses where he remembered the hitching rail to stand, and walk straight toward the 2 banks that faced the plaza. Each man wrapped himself in a blanket when the time came to sleep, but no one slept easily. They lay with boots within reach, hats near their hands, and weapons ready to be lifted the moment the first light touched the tops of the trees, and it came time to mount and turn their horses toward the town that would test the entire plan. On the morning of Wednesday, October 5th, 1892, light reached the camp on Onion Creek west of Coffeyville while 5 men pushed blankets aside and stepped into cold air that carried the smell of wet earth and horses. The creek moved steadily over stones a short distance away, and the branches overhead showed a pale edge as dawn gathered. Saddles that had served on long rides lay ready. Rifles leaned where each man had left them the night before. No one spoke much. The decisions made in that hollow during the past days now had to turn into motion. Bob Dalton checked his watch in the half-light and gave a short order to start breaking camp. Coffee boiled in a dented pot over a small fire that barely showed beyond the ring of stones holding it. Each man took a cup and drank the bitter liquid without lingering. Bedrolls were rolled tight and strapped behind saddles. Grain was poured for the horses, who worked through it with steady movements, then accepted bridles and saddles with the familiarity of animals long used to sudden travel. Harness buckles clicked, cinches tightened, and the men took final looks at the ground to be sure nothing recognizable remained. Clothing and disguises came out of saddlebags and were put on with deliberate care. Great pulled on a dark coat that hung lower than his usual trail jacket, and adjusted a false mustache that sat under his nose with stiff edges held in place by gum. Powers combed his hair down over his forehead and checked a pair of whiskers meant to change the shape of his jawline. Broadwell shifted into a new suit coat and high collar, garments that turned him from a range hand into something more like a traveling salesman at a quick glance. Bob and Emmett had trimmed their hair and mustaches short in recent days and now buttoned clean shirts and town coats that differed sharply from the clothes they wore on ranches and in outlaw camps. Under these coats, they set their weapons in place. Each man carried a Winchester rifle and a Colt revolver, but only the revolvers rode openly at their hips. Rifles were held close along their legs or carried in such a way that the barrels ran near their trousers and boots. Bob repeated the instruction that no one was to raise a rifle into clear view until the men stood at the doors of the banks. Surprise remained the one advantage that could not be gambled away. Once anyone on the streets of Coffeyville saw long guns and raised voices, every plan fixed in the camp would have to fight its way through gun smoke and confusion. When the horses were ready and the men were mounted, Bob led the way out of the trees and up toward the road that ran eastward into town. The sun had climbed only a little above the horizon and lay behind a thin layer of cloud, giving the land a flat light that left few shadows. The prairie between the creek and Coffeyville held fenced fields, cut stubble, and a few scattered houses with thin chimney smoke rising into still air. Iron rails of the railroad line glinted faintly further north. The 5 riders held an easy pace, letting their horses jog rather than gallop so that sweat would not streak the animals' coats before they reached the town streets. Conversation on the ride stayed focused on the sequence they had gone over repeatedly at camp. Bob reminded Emmett that they would turn down 8th Street and ride behind the row of buildings that faced the plaza. He repeated that once they dismounted, they would walk in a fixed order toward the banks, 3 men forming the lead line and 2 following behind. When they stepped clear of the alley and into sight of the square, they would cross to the C.M. Condon and Company Bank first, then split with Bob and Emmett, continuing on to the First National Bank across the way. The words came out as firm statements, not questions. Each man had heard them many times, yet Bob spoke them again as if forcing them into the morning air. Emmett rode slightly behind his older brother and looked ahead to where the town would soon come into view. He knew Coffeyville from years earlier when his family had lived near Robbins Corners and he had gone into town for supplies, fairs, and church gatherings. Faces and street corners from those days moved through his mind in fragments. A merchant laughing, a girl stepping down from a wagon, a boy running along a board sidewalk with dust kicking at his heels. Those memories did not change the course of his horse's hooves. The line of riders kept its shape as they crested a low rise and saw the taller roofs and brick fronts of Coffeyville ahead. Coffeyville that morning presented its ordinary working face. Smoke from kitchen stoves marked frame houses on the edges. Closer to the center, brick buildings showed their fronts to the streets. Signs painted in block letters marked the locations of stores that handled hardware, clothing, groceries, and farm implements. The tracks of the railroad ran near the business district where depots and warehouses took in freight. Wagons already rattled along the streets as farmers and merchants brought produce and goods to town. On the main square, men swept board sidewalks in front of shops, opened shutters, and rolled back awnings in the first tasks of the day. The 5 riders entered Coffeyville from the west, moving along 8th Street as they had planned. Hooves rang on the packed surface and struck loose stones where road work during past months had torn the street and left ruts and ridges. Dust rose under the horses and hung behind them in a pale trail. At ordinary times, men who rode in together on a work morning might draw a glance and little more. On this day, however, these riders wore new town clothes that did not carry the worn seat and faded elbows of local ranch hands. Their hats were pulled low and their faces carried artificial hair that did not match memory for anyone who knew them well. The gang expected to see the hitching rail that Bob remembered, standing behind the Condon Bank. Years had passed since he had walked those alleys, and he now looked for the familiar row of posts where horses could be tied under partial cover between buildings. When they reached the place where the rail had once been, they found open ground and signs of street work instead. The posts and crossbars had been removed. Parts of the ground showed fresh cuts for utilities and leveling. Brick backs of the adjoining structures rose bare without any structure that would shelter their animals from view. For a moment the riders slowed and conversation narrowed to quick words carried from one man to another. The original plan could not be followed. They could not leave their only means of escape standing in the open where anyone on the square could see saddles and reins, and where stray gunfire might reach them if a fight started. Bob scanned the nearest options and fixed on the alley that ran north and south a short distance to the west of the banks, near the city jail and livery fences. The alley offered a stretch of fence and outbuildings where horses could be hitched close together, and where walls might screen them from direct fire coming from the plaza. Bob turned his horse into that alley without hesitation, and the others followed. The animal's hooves clattered on hard-packed dirt between the buildings. The narrow passage held stable doors, stacked lumber and barrels set along one side. On the other side, a fence line offered places where reins could be looped and tied. The city jail stood near this lane, a plain stone structure with barred windows that looked over a yard. A small carriage shed and other outbuildings crowded the space. It was not the sheltered run between the two banks that Bob had envisioned, but it gave the gang a place to dismount without standing in full view of the center of town. The men swung down from their saddles with practiced ease. Each rider tied his horse to the available fence or post, taking care to keep the animals close enough together that they could be mounted quickly as a group. Cinches and bridles were checked again by habit. No one loosened a girth or removed any gear. These horses would not be waiting for long rest. The alley smelled of manure, damp wood, and the faint sour odor of the jail yard. Overhead, the strip of sky between building roofs brightened further as the sun climbed, warning them that workday traffic on the nearby streets would only grow thicker. Once their mounts were secured, the men shifted attention to their own gear. Coats were tugged straight, hats settled on heads, and rifle stocks positioned so that the weapons could be raised in one motion from their concealment. Bob repeated the sequence for the last time in a low voice. Great, Powers, and Broadwell would lead. Bob and Emmett would follow several steps behind. They would walk eastward through the remainder of the alley and step onto Walnut Street, forming a column of 3 in front and 2 behind. From there, the front 3 would angle toward the entrance of the Condon Bank, while the rear pair crossed toward the First National Bank. Timing mattered down to the length of a breath. The 5 men moved out of the alley in that formation. Boots struck the packed earth in steady rhythm. Rifles rested close to their trousers, barrels angled down and receivers hidden by long coats. Revolvers on their hips sat where hands could find them instantly. As they approached the mouth of the alley, sounds from the town square grew clear. The creak of wagon springs, the ring of a hammer from a blacksmith shop, voices calling greetings along the boardwalks. The air carried the smell of coal smoke from locomotives and the mingled scents of horse dust and fresh sawn lumber. When they reached the sidewalk line and stepped into full view of the square, the 5 outlaws drew the first close looks from Coffeyville citizens. Their column crossed Walnut Street from west to east. At a short distance, it still looked like a group of strangers had come in to conduct business or move freight. At only a few steps, however, the faces under the hats and false hair stood out with more clarity. Merchant Alec McKenna stood near the front of his place of business and watched them pass within a distance close enough for him to study each man. Despite the disguises, he recognized one of the Dalton brothers from years earlier when the family had lived nearby. Recognition struck quickly. McKenna's expression changed from casual attention to sharp focus as the gang went by. He did not step forward to challenge armed men in unfamiliar clothes. Instead, he withdrew into his shop and spoke to those inside, delivering a warning in plain words that the Daltons were on the street. From the doorway and nearby windows, other men looked toward the 5 figures now crossing toward the banks. Information moved from voice to voice faster than the gang's walking pace, carrying the name Dalton into hardware stores, general stores, and offices that boxed the square. The gang felt the eyes on them as they walked. False whiskers itched against skin. Coat collars suddenly felt too tight. Yet no one broke stride. Great kept his shoulders squared and his head level as he guided the lead rank toward the Condon Bank. Powers and Broadwell flanked him, boots hitting the boards outside the bank's front. Behind them, Bob and Emmett angled slightly away to position themselves for a straight line to the First National Bank on the opposite side of the open space. Each man stayed within reach of his companions but held to the split that would put them into both buildings within the next moments. The square itself held the ordinary motion of a work morning even as the warning spread. A wagon rolled past carrying sacks of grain toward a warehouse. A boy led a team of mules toward a livery stable near the tracks. A clerk left a storefront carrying a stack of ledgers and paused as he saw the armed figures move with an urgency that did not match a casual errand. These citizens had not yet reached for guns. They had, however, begun to understand that men with a known outlaw name had just stepped from a side alley and were advancing on the 2 banks that handled the town's savings and loans. As the lead 3 reached the steps of the Condon Bank, Great lifted his rifle into open view for the first time that day. The motion was smooth and controlled rather than hurried. The long barrel rose out from under his coat and came level with the broad front window of the bank. Powers and Broadwell matched the movement, letting their own Winchesters clear cloth and hang ready in front of them. The shift transformed their appearance instantly from well-dressed strangers into armed attackers. Inside the bank, figures near the counter turned as the shadows of the rifles moved across the glass. Across the way, Bob and Emmett covered the last yards to the front of the First National Bank. They moved at a quick walk rather than a full run, preserving a thin air of control that still did not hide the intent written in their posture and in the weapons they carried close by their legs. Behind them, the echo of the first shouted reports from merchants and bystanders grew louder. Men inside hardware stores began to step toward racks where rifles stood stacked muzzle upward. Hands reached for keys that opened glass cases containing revolvers and boxes of cartridges. The town's defenses had started to form even before a single order came from any officer. Doorways on both banks lay directly ahead. The Daltons and their 2 companions had reached the edge of the trap they had set for themselves. They possessed the element of immediate force, with rifles and revolvers ready, and the surprise inside the bank still working in their favor. At the same time, their horses stood in an exposed alley that funneled any escape into a narrow lane near the jail. Men on the streets had already spoken their name. Each step they now took through the bank doors would deepen a situation that no longer matched the original plan made on Onion Creek, and from which retreat would demand blood on both sides of the square. Morning of Wednesday, October 5th, 1892. The glass door of the First National Bank swung inward as Bob Dalton stepped across the threshold with his Winchester already coming up from under his coat. Emmett followed a pace behind, grain sack folded in his left hand, revolver holstered at his side. Inside, the bank smelled of ink, paper, and the faint metallic odor that clung to coin. Morning light came through the front windows and fell across a polished counter, tall stools and ledgers stacked in neat rows. Behind the counter, cashier Thomas G. Ayres and teller W. H. Shepard looked up from their work, their faces shifting from routine attention to shock as they saw the rifle barrel level across the room. Bob did not waste words. He told everyone within sight to raise their hands and stay quiet. The sharp tone cut through the normal murmur of the bank and froze movement. Ayers straightened slowly, his hands coming up from the blotter on his desk. Shepard pushed his stool back, knocking its legs against the wood partition, and lifted his arms. Bookkeeper B.S. Ayers, related to the cashier, stood near the rear and paused with a ledger still in his grasp before he also raised his hands. A couple of customers in town clothes near the front counter turned toward the door and saw the long gun and the hard set of Bob's jaw. Emmett moved quickly along the inner side of the counter, keeping his body angled so that his revolver could be drawn in an instant. He ordered the bankmen to leave their positions and step toward the rear, where the safe and vault stood. The customers were told to move with them. Leather soles scuffed the floor as the group shuffled backward, hands high, while Bob kept the Winchester steady and walked a line that allowed him to watch both the front windows and the living bodies in front of him. The quiet of the bank had turned heavy rather than loud, broken only by short commands and the nervous breathing of the captives. The vault door in First National did not stand closed on a rigid time lock that morning. Its outer metal face sat ajar. The heavy door swung partly open while work went on. Inside, a safe with inner compartments held currency and coin. Emmett reached the rear of the bank and forced Thomas Ayers to step beside the vault. He thrust the empty grain sack into the cashier's hands and ordered him to start filling it with paper money and loose cash from the accessible compartments. Ayers hesitated for a heartbeat, then began to obey, pulling stacks of bills and handfuls of coin and dropping them into the sack with shaking hands that made the canvas jump. Bob kept his place where he could see both the front windows and the men at the rear. He did not look away from the street for long, knowing that danger would come from outside sooner than from the captives who stared at the muzzles of his rifle and the revolver at Emmett's hip. He told Shepard and the other employees to lie on the floor once the filling started, then changed that order and made them stand near the vault instead, where they could be moved at a moment's notice if the gang needed human shields to cover their exit. Their backs pressed against the cold iron while the sack grew heavy. Sounds from outside filtered through the front glass. At first they were the normal noises of a busy square, wagon wheels over ruts, voices calling in greeting, a horse snorting. As precious seconds passed, those sounds shifted. A sharper edge crept in, the tone of men raising their voices in alarm rather than routine talk, feet hitting board sidewalks at a faster pace, shutters banging. Bob heard a shout that carried the Dalton name and felt the change in the air. His rifle still covered the lobby, but his mind measured the shrinking time before the town's men reached for their own guns. Emmett pressed Ayers to work faster. The cashier's fingers fumbled at stacks of currency and bundles of bank paper. Loose coin rang against the inside of the sack, dull thuds of silver and gold piling against one another. Sweat stood out on Ayers's forehead, cutting pale streaks through dust at his hairline. The bookkeeper tried to speak once, some plea to spare the bank or the people inside it, but Emmett cut him off with a short order to stay silent and keep still. Shepard stared at the scene, eyes fixed on the rifle and the growing bulk of the sack that held other people's savings. The first shot from outside punched through the front window without warning, a hard crack of glass and a sharper crack of the bullet passing into the interior. Fragments sprayed across the floor near the counter. The projectile buried itself in the wall behind Bob, showering dust and splinters over the banking room. For a brief instant there was stunned silence, then the captives flinched and ducked by instinct before Bob barked orders that dragged them back upright. The citizens of Coffeyville had found rifles and taken positions in hardware store doorways and upper windows, and now their fire was reaching into the bank. Bob shifted slightly, keeping his body behind a thick section of the counter while he watched both the broken pane and the captives still bunched near the rear. Another bullet struck the wooden frame of the window, driving more glass inward. Shouts outside rose in volume, mixed with the deeper thud of heavy boots on the boardwalk as more men ran toward vantage points. Emmett ordered everyone near the vault to move closer together, boxing them in against the iron so that a single shifting of the Winchester's muzzle could cover all of them. The grain sack sagged with weight, close to full, its mouth still held in Ayres's hands. The bank employees understood that the danger now came from two directions at once. If they bolted for the front, they risked stepping into the line of fire from their own townsmen. If they moved against the two armed robbers in the rear, they faced gun muzzles at near point-blank range. Thomas Ayres swallowed hard and glanced once toward the shattered front glass, where daylight now slanted in through jagged edges, then kept stuffing currency into the sack until Emmett snapped that it was enough. Emmett gripped the sack himself, testing its weight with both hands, and then took control of it entirely, dragging the loaded canvas up so that it rested against his shoulder. More rounds tore into the building. One struck a metal bar near the window and sang off with a shrill note. Another thudded into the counterfront, throwing slivers of wood across the floor where customers had stood only minutes earlier. Bob fired a short answer through the fractured glass. A single shot meant less as a kill attempt than as a warning that the men inside would shoot back at any silhouette that presented itself. The report cracked inside the bank and drove the captives tighter against the rear wall. Smoke from the powder hung briefly in the still air before drifting upward. A figure appeared for a moment at the edge of that broken front window. A glimpse of a young man in shirt sleeves who had edged too close in curiosity or courage. Bob saw only part of the shape, but he saw enough. His rifle came up and he sent another round out through the gap. The bullet caught the man and drove him backward toward the boardwalk. That man, Lucius Baldwin, dropped in front of the bank he had approached moments earlier as the town tried to organize its defense. The shot carried a message across the square that any attempt to press close to the bank while the outlaws remained inside risked death. Inside the building, the danger to the captives grew with each exchange. Glass lay in drifts under the windows. Wood around the frames showed fresh scars. The men who had faces known to nearly everyone in Coffeyville now kept others' bodies between their guns and the wider street, using the bank employees and customers as a barrier against the bullets that slashed in from outside. Bob ordered Ayres, Shepard, B.S. Ayres, and the customers to move toward the front, hands still raised. Emmett walked just behind them with the heavy sack and his revolver, while Bob fell in at the rear with his Winchester, covering both the hostages and the window. They advanced slowly through the lobby, glass crunching under their boots. The captives stepped carefully to avoid cutting their shoes and ankles. Every movement was exposed to eyes on the street through the shattered windows. Yet any attempt by Coffeyville riflemen to take a clear shot now carried the risk of hitting their own townsmen. The hostages' shoulders were tight, their backs stiff, as they moved under orders, aware that their bodies now formed the only shield between the outlaws and the men aiming from the other side of the square. As they neared the front door, another bullet crashed through what remained of the window glass and passed close enough to one of the hostages that the man flinched sideways and nearly fell. Emmett grabbed his arm, both to steady him and to keep the shield wall intact. Bob called out through the doorway that any further firing would kill the citizens standing in front of the gang. His voice carried harshly into the square. Men outside could not see every detail through dust and glass fragments, but they understood from the movement behind the window that local bank officers were being forced toward the exit under threat of death. On the street, the response to that sight was divided. Some citizens crouched behind hitching rails and doorway jambs, rifles in hand, trying to find angles that showed outlaw bodies without innocent men in the way. Others ran to hardware stores for more ammunition or to pass weapons to latecomers. The earlier scramble into Isham Brothers and Mansour Hardware and A.P. Boswell's store had already placed Winchesters in the hands of clerks, blacksmiths, and farmers who now took up positions along the edges of buildings and in upstairs rooms. Every eye watched the front of First National, knowing that the moment the gang stepped clear with their money and their captives, the confrontation would spill fully into the open. Inside, Bob and Emmett reached the door. Bob pushed it open with the barrel of his rifle, keeping his finger near the trigger. The captives stood so close that the wood brushed one man's shoulder as the door swung out. Heat and light from the square washed into the close air of the bank lobby, along with the mixed smell of dust, horse, and powder smoke that already drifted in from earlier shots. Emmett shifted the weight of the grain sack, adjusting it so that he could move and fire if needed without dropping the money they had come to take. The gang needed to reach the alley where their horses stood, yet every step between the bank door and that narrow lane passed under sights now leveled from doorways, windows, and corners around the square. Bob leaned forward slightly, scanning for movement. He looked from the doorway of Isham Brothers and Mansour to the upper windows across the street and to the corners where men might rise from cover. His rifle remained close to the spine of the last hostage in the line, a warning that any burst of fire from outside would bring immediate killing inside the moving group. With one last order to the bankmen to keep walking straight and keep their hands high, Bob began to push them out into Walnut Street. Emmett fell into position behind them with the money sack and his revolver. The sound of their boots on the threshold marked the point where the holdup inside First National ended, and the running gunfight through Coffeyville truly began. A fight that would draw in citizens from every side of the square and turn the open space between the banks and the alley behind the jail into a killing ground. Grat Dalton reached the door of the C.M. Condon and Company Bank with his Winchester already high in both hands, and pushed inside with Bill Powers on his right and Dick Broadwell on his left. The room they entered held polished counters, tall desks, and high windows that let in clear light from Walnut Street. Ink bottles, blotters, and ledgers lay in ordered rows. Behind the counter stood Bank President C.T. Carpenter, Cashier Charles M. Ball, and bookkeeper Tom C. Babb. A customer near the front turned at the same instant and froze as he saw 3 rifles aimed directly into the working heart of the institution. Great shouted for every person in the room to get their hands up and stay still. His voice had the flat tone of a man used to giving orders on a cattle drive with no trace of hesitation. Carpenter straightened slowly, eyes locked on the dark circle of the nearest gun barrel. Ball's hands rose from his ledger, fingers stained with ink. Babb stepped back a pace, nearly stumbling into a tall stool, then forced himself upright with his palms in the air. The lone customer, a townsman in work clothes, raised his hands in the same awkward motion and looked quickly from one gunman to another. Powers moved to the inside of the counter with his rifle angled across his body. Broadwell swung the door that led behind the counter and stepped through, his boots thudding on the boards in the enclosed space where the bank kept its cash and records. Great kept his position in the open and covered the entire group, his eyes shifting from face to face. He ordered Carpenter and Ball to step away from their desks and lead the way toward the rear where the vault stood, a heavy structure of iron and steel set into the wall. Babb and the customer were told to follow, hands still high. As the small procession moved backward through the bank, chairs scraped, loose papers slid from desks, and an inkwell tipped over, spreading a dark stain across a ledger page. The room's usual sounds of pens and quiet conversation had vanished. In their place came the shuffle of shoes and the low scrape of rifle muzzles on wood as the robbers kept their weapons trained on the men in front of them. The air that had smelled of paper and lamp oil now held the sharper scent of gunpowder carried on the clothing of armed men who had handled their ammunition only hours earlier at a creekside camp. The vault door stood slightly open on its hinges, revealing a steel front and inner safe with compartments for currency and coin. Great pointed his rifle at Ball and told him to open everything that held money. Ball moved closer to the vault, his shoulders tight and his neck stiff. He pulled the outer door wider, reached for a handle, and then turned his head slightly toward Grat. In a level voice, he stated that the inner compartment operated on a time lock and that it would not open until the mechanism released later in the morning. His hand rested on the dial, but he did not turn it. Grat's expression hardened. He stepped closer so that the muzzle of his rifle nearly touched Ball's coat. He ordered the cashier to fill a grain sack that Powers produced with all accessible cash while they waited for the lock release. Ball reached into the open compartments that did not depend on the inner mechanism and drew out stacks of banknotes and handfuls of silver. The bills went into the sack in quick, jerking motions. Coin followed, dropping with dull weight that pulled the canvas lower toward the floor. Each movement of his hands took place under the constant pressure of Great's stare and the black circle of the rifle barrel. Powers watched the process with his back to one wall, covering the remaining captives. Carpenter stood rigid, wrists rigid above his head, watching the man he had hired load currency into a bag for armed intruders. Bab pressed himself against the rear partition, eyes fixed on Broadwell's rifle as it hovered near his midsection. The customer stood slightly apart, aware that every twitch of his muscles could draw a reaction. He looked once toward the front windows where bright daylight still showed the outlines of buildings across the street, then froze again when Powers shifted his stance in warning. Ball continued to work inside the vault, moving carefully. He reached for bundles and packets that could be taken without touching the combination dial of the deeper compartment. The time lock claim gave him a narrow edge of control. He explained again that the inner safe held the bulk of the bank's reserves and that the mechanism would not release until a set hour. He spoke without raising his voice, almost conversational in tone, but the line of his jaw showed strain. Great listened with narrowed eyes. He ordered Ball to keep filling the sack from what he could reach and said there would be no hesitation when the lock released. Outside, sound began to change in a way that reached even the closed room of the bank. Hoofbeats and wagon noise faded under a sharper pattern of boots hitting boardwalks at speed. Voices rose, some calling warnings, others calling for rifles. The words reached the interior only as a muffled rush through walls and glass, but the shift in tone was clear. The citizens of Coffeyville had finished recognizing the intruders and were now arming themselves. Carpenter's gaze lifted involuntarily toward the front of the building as the noise grew clearer, then snapped back to the muzzle that never left his chest. The first sign that the robbers inside faced more than unseen movement outside came in the form of a crack of a rifle somewhere across the square, followed by the sharp report of a bullet hitting brick near the front window. Fine dust drifted from the frame. A second shot punched through the glass, shards flying inward in a glittering spray that cut across the room. Every captive flinched. Broadwell jerked his head toward the front as slivers of glass skidded across the counter and dropped to the floor, tinkling against the iron footrests where customers usually rested their boots while speaking with bank officers. Great reacted instantly, barking at everyone to stay upright and keep their hands high. He adjusted his position so that his body now stood in line with the captives, using their forms as partial cover from any further fire aimed through the windows. His rifle tracked the movements of Carpenter and Ball, who stood near the vault and front counter respectively. The customer remained pinned in place near the end of the counter, now serving unwillingly as part of a shield line that faced both inward toward the robbers and outward toward the marksmen gathering in the square. Another bullet came through a pane with a hard crack and struck inside the bank. This one hit Broadwell. The slug tore into his flesh along his side and knocked him backward against the inner wall with enough force to drive air from his lungs. His rifle slipped for an instant in his grip before he hauled it back up with a grimace. Blood darkened his shirt and coat, marking a clear line down his torso. The wound did not drop him to the floor, but it changed the atmosphere inside the bank. The outlaws now knew that men outside had fixed ranges and were willing to send rounds into the building even with civilians visible behind the glass. Broadwell shifted his stance and pressed his shoulder against the wood to steady himself. Pain etched itself across his face. He took a deeper grip on his rifle, refusing to let it sag even as crimson spots spread across the fabric at his waist. Powers adjusted position to cover more of the room, keeping one eye on the wounded man and the other on the captives. The air in the bank felt tighter, filled with glass dust and the sharp reek of fresh powder from the bullets punching through windows and brick. Carpenter and Babb stared at the blood on Broadwell's coat with expressions that mixed fear and a grim recognition that Coffeyville citizens were now fighting for the bank from outside. Ball stood motionless for a moment with his hands still inside the vault, then resumed filling the sack at a faster pace. Every handful he dropped into the bag made a solid thump inside the thick canvas. Great pressed him to move faster, his words short and clipped. He warned that any sign of delay or false move would bring instant death. Ball answered only with another reach into the compartments, pulling out every stack he could reach without touching the inner dial. Shots from the street came with increasing frequency. Some rounds struck the front wall, sending chips of brick across the sill. Others passed fully inside and lodged in wood or plaster. A bullet hit the frame of a picture hanging behind the counter, shattering glass that fell in dull chunks. Another slug tore through a ledger on a desk, punching into paper and leaving a spray of torn pages on the floor. Each strike made the captives flinch and narrowed the chances that no one inside would be struck down in the crossfire. Great ordered the group to move away from the front windows toward the rear of the room, taking their loaded sack with them. Ball clutched the neck of the bag while Powers kept his rifle pointed at the small of the cashier's back. Carpenter and Babb shuffled sideways, their raised hands still in the air, trying to keep their footing among scattered glass and papers. The customer followed, his eyes wide, his shoulders hunched in expectation of another shot tearing through the bank. Gradually, the cluster of men moved to a position where the vault door, the inner wall, and their own bodies lay between them and most of the window openings. The robbers conferred in short bursts of speech that the captives heard but did not fully follow. Great studied Broadwell's wound, checked that the rifle still functioned, and then pulled his attention back to the question of the vault. Ball repeated that the inner compartment could not open until the time mechanism released. Great's jaw set hard. He had wanted the solid reserves inside that deeper chamber as much as any bills already in the sack, knowing that those funds represented loan payments, deposits, and reserves gathered over years. The loud reports from outside, however, forced him to weigh the reality that each additional minute inside the bank increased the number of rifles pointed at its doors and windows. Ball suggested that they could continue to wait, keeping his tone neutral. His words hinted that more money than they had already taken lay behind the sealed iron. Gret looked at him sharply, then glanced toward Powers and Broadwell. His eyes passed over the bloodstain, the shattered glass, and the positions of the captives lined along the wall. Outside, the noise no longer sounded like scattered firing. It carried the more organized pattern of men settling into fixed positions around the square. The presence of hardware stores nearby meant more rifles every moment, and he knew nothing inside the building could change that. In the end, Gret made a hard choice. He told Ball to tie off the sack and step aside. The bag already held a substantial amount in notes and coin, though not the entire contents of the vault. Powers jerked the sack from the cashier's hands and shifted it over his own shoulder, testing its weight. Broadwell moved toward the group, his left hand still pressed to his side where blood seeped between his fingers. Great ordered Carpenter, Ball, Bab, and the customer to cluster close together. Their bodies would form a moving barrier when the time came to leave the bank. The next step required exposing the group to the fire coming from outside. Great signaled for the hostages to move toward the front again, this time staying close to the inner wall and seeking any fragment of cover it offered. They walked in short steps, careful not to slip on the scattered glass. Powers followed with the sack and his rifle. Broadwell kept pace despite his injury, breathing harder with each stride but keeping the muzzle of his weapon steady. Great took the rear, his rifle held in a way that allowed him to fire instantly past the right shoulder of the rearmost captive if any figure appeared in the doorway with a gun. As they neared the front of the bank, more bullets struck the building. One round smashed what remained of a window and sent a burst of glass across the floor near the advancing group. Another slug punched into the edge of the counter, splintering the wood and leaving a jagged scar. The hostages hunched their shoulders and kept moving, driven by Great's sharp commands and the knowledge that they were more likely to survive if they remained between the attackers and the rifles outside. The room that had started the morning in quiet routine now resembled a small battlefield, with shattered fixtures, blood on the floor, and gun smoke drifting in layers near the ceiling. At the threshold, Grat paused long enough to look through a fragment of intact glass at the square. He saw movement across Walnut Street at Isham Brothers and Mansour Hardware and at other storefronts. Men crouched behind posts and door frames, Winchesters at the ready. Faces he did not know and some he half recognized stared back toward the bank with expressions that mixed fear and determination. A body lay out near the street, not moving, marked by the sprawled limbs of a man struck down in the early exchange of fire. It was clear that any attempt to step through the doorway would draw a new storm of bullets. There was no time for hesitation. The longer they waited, the more men in Coffeyville would reach the square with rifles, revolvers, and shotguns. Great pulled the door open with a swift motion and ordered the hostages forward. Carpenter stepped over the threshold first, hands still high, followed by Ball, Bab, and the customer. All packed close together. Powers came next with the sack of money, then Broadwell with his wounded side braced against the jamb for an instant as he crossed into the open air. Great stepped out last, rifle sweeping across the array of windows and doorways opposite. The robbery inside the Condon Bank had stalled under time pressure and gunfire, ending without the full contents of the vault but with enough cash to weigh heavy on the men carrying it. As they emerged into Walnut Street, grouped closely around their hostages, they faced a square now lined with armed townsmen and a storm of bullets ready to meet any move toward the alley where their horses waited. The struggle that had begun inside led directly into the larger battle that was turning Coffeyville's central streets into a place of splintered wood, fallen men, and rolling powder smoke. Late morning, Wednesday, October 5th, 1892. While the 5 masked riders held bank employees and customers at gunpoint inside the 2 buildings, Coffeyville's defense formed in the same short stretch of minutes. After Alec McKenna recognized the Daltons crossing the square and shouted the alarm inside his store, men spilled into the street with unfinished chores and half-spoken sentences left behind them. Some ran toward the front of the banks for a closer look. Others turned instead toward the hardware stores that lined the square, understanding that bare hands and courage alone would not stop men carrying Winchesters. At Isham Brothers and Mansour Hardware, partner Henry Isham stepped from his counter as the first frightened customers pushed through the door. The store's racks held rows of rifles and shotguns, stocks polished by years of handling. Boxes of cartridges sat stacked behind the counter. When the cry went up that the Daltons were in town and armed, Isham and his clerks began handing out guns with quick movements, sliding Winchesters across the counter to any man who promised to use one and knew enough to work the action. Cartridges were ripped from boxes and pushed into magazines with fingers that shook only for a moment before training and anger steadied them. A few doors away at A.P. Boswell's hardware store, the scene repeated in its own details. Boswell reached under his counter for shotguns and rifles, his face tight as he listened to the growing noise from the square. Clerks passed weapons to farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants who had thrown down brooms or ledgers to answer the alarm. Some of these citizens had served in the late war and knew exactly how quickly a fight could turn. Others had never faced live fire, but the knowledge that their wages, savings, and families depended on what happened in the next minutes drove them to take up arms without delay. Marshal Charles T. Connolly moved through this growing commotion with his badge pinned under his coat and a rifle in his hands. The city marshal had heard the first shouted warning and crossed from his office toward Walnut Street as the 5 outlaws disappeared into the 2 banks. He called men by name, ordered them to arm themselves, and directed them toward positions that covered the bank fronts and the alley where he knew the robbers had left their horses. His voice cut through the confusion, turning scattered volunteers into a rough line of defense. Some he sent into Isham Hardware to fire from the doorway and front windows. Others he stationed near Boswell's, where they could see across the open space toward the banks and down toward the livery buildings. From the 2nd floor over Isham Brothers and Mansour, men leaned out of windows with rifles braced on sills. From there they could see the fronts of both banks and the strip of alley that reached from the square toward the jail. On the street level, shooters crouched behind hitching rails and posts, using the thick wood as partial cover. At the corners of nearby buildings, citizens took a knee and rested rifle barrels along brick edges. The square that had started the morning as a place of trade and errands now held a growing ring of armed townsmen watching the doors of the Condon Bank and First National for any sign of movement. Inside the banks, the robbers still forced captives to fill grain sacks with currency and coin. Outside, the short-time Grat had insisted on waiting near the supposed time lock inside the Condon vault, let more men reach Isham's and Boswell's and get weapons in their hands. Connolly counted the rifles visible along the storefronts, then left the immediate square by cutting toward a vacant lot that would let him reach the alley from the far side. His plan was simple. Close the path to the horses while the volunteers in front held the banks under their guns. He ran across 9th Street, rifle in both hands, boots pounding hard dirt that only moments earlier had seen nothing heavier than wagon wheels and casual foot traffic. The first real exchange of fire began along the front of the banks while the marshal moved around the block. As Bob and Emmett pushed their hostages toward the door of First National and bullets from anxious riflemen cracked through the windows, Isham's front doorway flashed with muzzle bursts. Men inside the hardware store fired at any glimpse of a robber through broken glass, trying to avoid hitting the townsmen held in front of them. Rounds struck the brick around the bank windows, punched into frames, and sent glass cascading inward. Splinters and lime dust drifted down over the banking rooms. The careful order of ledgers and counters had already given way to overturned stools and scattered papers, and now the walls themselves began to show fresh scars. Near the First National entrance, citizen Charles T. Gump shouldered a shotgun and tried to find a clear angle toward the door. He stood not far from the front, watching for a chance to fire without endangering captives. When he raised the weapon, Bob saw the movement through the broken pane and fired once with his Winchester. The bullet struck Gump through the hand and smashed into the shotgun, spoiling the weapon and driving the man backward. Gump fell away from the doorway, wounded and out of the fight, while other volunteers behind him shifted to close the opening he had tried to use. Across the square, glass in the Condon Bank windows shattered under similar pressure. Shots from Isham's and other positions tore through the panes and into the interior. One of these bullets hit Broadwell, cutting into his side while he stood near the vault. Another round struck Powers as he moved within the bank. Both men stayed on their feet, but their coats now showed dark stains. The wounds slowed their movements and added an edge of desperation to every order Grat gave. Ball, Carpenter, Babb, and the lone customer remained in front of raised guns, pinned between the robbers and the fire from outside, aware that any sudden movement from them could draw bullets from either direction. The pressure on the robbers forced them to move their captives once again. At First National, Bob and Emmett lined up Ayers, Shepard, B.S. Ayers, and the customers in front of them and drove the group toward the front entrance with the sack of money slung on Emmett's shoulder. At the Condon Bank, Great forced Carpenter, Ball, Babb, and the customer into a tight cluster and steered them toward the door, while Powers hauled the filled sack and Broadwell covered the rear as well as his wound allowed. In both buildings, the bank officers felt rifle muzzles at their backs and saw broken glass glittering on the floor ahead, while the noise from the square rose in pitch. When the doors swung open on both banks, movement on Walnut Street paused for a few heartbeats as citizens tried to understand what they saw. From First National, a string of hostages emerged with their hands high, pressed forward by Bob and Emmett. From the Condon Bank, another knot of men stepped into the light with rifles at their backs and a canvas sack obvious among them. The robbers stayed close behind their captives, making sure that any shot from Isham's or Boswell's or the building corners would have to pass through the bodies of Coffeyville citizens before reaching outlaw flesh. Some marksmen held their fire entirely as the human shield stepped into the street. Others shifted position, looking for narrow angles where a rifle barrel, hat brim, or coat sleeve showed clear enough to risk a shot without striking a neighbor. The sound of boots on boardwalks carried from side streets as more men ran toward the square with rifles and shotguns. Windows in upper floors opened and arms extended, muzzles glinting in the daylight. Horses tied along the street tossed their heads and stamped, nerves jangled by the crack of gunfire and the shouting that filled the air. Bob kept his rifle close to the spine of the last man in the line coming out of First National, and told the captives to keep walking toward the middle of the street. Emmett moved beside them with the money sack balanced and his revolver ready. At the same time, Great's group stepped from the Condon doorway, hugging the wall as they worked their way toward a point where they could angle across toward the alley. Ball still carried the weight of what had been taken from his bank, even as he walked under threat of death. Carpenter and the others moved with stiff legs, trying not to stumble on broken glass and splintered wood. The first opening for Coffeyville's defenders came when some of the hostages deliberately broke away. In the confusion near the center of the street, one of the men from the First National line saw a moment where Bob's attention shifted toward Isham's doorway. He dropped suddenly toward the ground, rolled toward a pile of curbstones, and crawled behind them. Another hostage bolted toward the near corner of a building, diving behind its brick face in 3 quick strides. A third darted back through the bank door when a shot from outside drove everyone to flinch for an instant. In that brief window, the line of human shields thinned and gun barrels on the square found clearer targets. Rifles on Isham's upper floor spoke again. A bullet snapped across the space in front of the First National and struck near the feet of the remaining captives, sending chips of stone flying. Another round from a second-floor window passed close to Bob and buried itself in the frame of the bank door. Near Boswell's, a Winchester barked and its slug hit wood near Grat's group, cutting a notch in the door jamb as the cluster of men moved along, using the bank wall as cover. The firing was no longer scattered. It came in short, overlapping bursts, each volley aimed at the figures now clearly identified as outlaws among the retreating hostages. Thomas Ayers seized his first chance to break away from his captors. When Bob ordered the group from First National to change direction and angle toward the alley, Ayers slipped sideways, then ran low toward the nearest doorway that promised more than a thin board sidewalk for protection. He pushed into one of the hardware stores and grabbed for the nearest rifle as men behind the counter shoved weapons into any reaching hand. Within moments, he stood at the front of that store, Winchester raised, determined to send a round back toward the men who had forced him at gunpoint only minutes earlier. Bob saw the figure in the doorway lifting a long gun and recognized the same bankman he had just driven into the street. Before Ayers could fire, Bob threw his own rifle to his shoulder and pressed the trigger. The bullet crossed the open space between Hardware and Street and struck Ayers in the head, dropping him where he stood. Men inside the store tried to pull him back, but further shots from the Condon side cut into the doorway and forced them down. One of those rounds hit Clerk T. Arthur Reynolds in the foot, putting another citizen out of the fight before he could send a single shot toward the gang. Around Isham's, the fight intensified. Owner H. Isham, joined by men such as M.A. Anderson and Charles K. Smith, loaded and fired from windows and door frames, feeding cartridges into Winchesters as fast as their fingers allowed. Every time a robber stepped clear of a shield or moved into a gap between buildings, rifles in the hardware store sent bullets toward him. Lead hammered the fronts of the banks and the lumber of nearby structures. Later, more than 80 marks would be counted on the face of the Condon Bank alone, each scarred spot a record of a shot driven by citizens determined to stop the raid before the Daltons reached their horses. Across the square on the ground in front of a drugstore opposite First National, another pair of citizens took up position. George Cubine, the merchant, stood with his Winchester leveled toward the bank entrance, watching for Bob and Emmett to appear free of hostages. Beside him, shoemaker Charles Brown stood close enough to touch his neighbor's elbow. Unarmed at first, but ready to pick up a rifle the moment the chance came. Both men had left their regular work at the first call that the banks were under attack and now faced the door of First National, with eyes fixed on the broken glass and moving shadows inside. Bob and Emmett, having lost some of their living shields and with fire increasing from the square, abandoned the idea of crossing the open plaza in a straight line. Instead, they pulled back inside the bank, pushed through to the rear, and used the back door to reach the narrow space that led toward Union Street. There, the alleys ran tight between buildings with windows overlooking them from both sides. As they moved through that confined strip, they met Lucius Baldwin, who had come with a revolver to watch the rear entrance. Bob ordered him to halt and drop his weapon. Baldwin did not comply. Bob shot him with the Winchester, and the man who had stepped forward in defense of his town fell in that passage. Another local body added to the cost of the fight. From the rear side of the block, Bob and Emmett turned toward Union Street and emerged where they could see Cubine and Brown near the drugstore. Cubine still held his Winchester aimed toward the front of the bank, unaware that the robbers had swung behind him. Bob raised his rifle and fired. Cubine fell with multiple wounds, dropping the weapon he had carried out to meet the gang. Brown bent to grab the fallen rifle, trying to bring it into play, and Bob shot him as he lifted it. Brown collapsed near his friend, two more Coffeyville defenders down in the space of moments. As these killings unfolded away from the immediate view of Isham's front, the three men from the Condon Bank tried to fight their way from their own doorway to the alley. Powers and Broadwell, already wounded, ran from the bank with Grat just behind them, all three snapping shots toward the hardware store where they could see muzzle flashes. Lead from Isham's and Boswell's cut into them almost at once. Dust puffed from their clothing as bullets struck. Powers staggered and veered toward a nearby door that he found locked, then pushed away from it and ran for the line of horses in the alley. Great kept firing, working his Winchester even as shots from the square tore into the barn and sheds near him. Between the banks and the mouth of the alley, the air filled with powder smoke and drifting grit kicked up by bullets hitting dirt and brick. Horses tied to an oil wagon in the open street went down under stray shots, collapsing in their traces while the wagon tongue tilted and its chains clanked. The animals hitched in the alley itself screamed and fought their reins as lead whined past them. The noise of the fight became a continuous roar of overlapping shots, shouted orders, and the harsh sounds of wounded men and horses struggling for breath. Marshal Connolly, having cut through the vacant lot on 9th Street, closed on the far end of the alley from the direction of the livery. Liveryman John Clore moved with him, rifle in hand, having left his stable when news reached him that the Daltons had tied their horses near his place of business. Alongside Clore ran town barber Carey Seaman, carrying a shotgun held tight across his chest. They used outbuildings and fences for cover, slipping between them to reach a position where they could see the line of tethered horses and the narrow space through which the gang would have to pass. By the time Bob and Emmett reached the junction of the rear passage and the alley, carrying the heavy sack from First National and their rifles, the entire area behind the banks had become as dangerous as the square they had left. From Isham's front and upper windows, from Boswell's doorway, from the corners of nearby buildings, and now from the livery side, rifles and shotguns aimed into the limited space where the gang's path converged. Great Powers and Broadwell moved toward the horses under this storm of fire, already marked by wounds from the dash out of the Condon Bank. Bob and Emmett, fresh from killing Cubine and Brown and shooting Ayers and Baldwin, pushed into the alley to join them. The citizens of Coffeyville had turned Walnut Street and the adjacent lanes into layered fields of fire. Every doorway, window, and fence line that faced the banks or the alley now held at least one armed defender. Marshal Connolly and the men with him took their places near the rear. Shooters in Isham's Hardware kept their barrels trained on any movement between the bank fronts and the jail yard. As the 5 outlaws closed on their horses, the town's improvised defense had narrowed their options to a single brutal choice: fight their way through the alley under converging fire, or fall where they stood among the buildings, horses, and bodies that already littered the rear of Coffeyville's business district. Gunfire from Isham Brothers and Mansour and A.P. Boswell's hardware stores beat against the backs of the 5 outlaws as they turned from Walnut Street into the narrow alley beside the city jail. The passage ran between rough fences and the stone wall of the jail yard, with shed roofs jutting out in places and a high oil tank set near the rear of the lot. Dirt underfoot had been packed hard by wagon wheels and hooves. The line of horses they had tied earlier stood along one side, eyes rolling white and flanks slick with sweat as bullets snapped overhead and splinters flew from posts and rails. Bob Dalton drove forward with his Winchester working and the heavy sack from First National still slung against his side. Emmett ran close behind, revolver in one hand and the canvas weight dragging on his shoulder. Great hugged the shelter of the oil tank near the head of the alley, rifle ready, eyes raking every opening. Bill Powers and Dick Broadwell angled toward the horses, bodies already marked by wounds taken as they burst from the Condon Bank. All 5 men now moved through a space no wider than a few wagon widths, while rifles on both sides of the fight poured rounds into the narrow channel. From the square behind them, shots from Isham's second floor and Boswell's front doorway drove into the alley mouth, chewing chips from the corner of the jail and punching white scars into the tank's iron skin. Ahead near the livery, Marshal Charles T. Connolly and liveryman John Clore had reached the far end of the passage. Barber Carey Seaman stood near them with a shotgun held tight against his shoulder, breath fast from the run across the vacant lot. They could hear the gang coming before they saw them, the sound of men shouting and metal striking stone as bullets ricocheted around the confined space. Powers reached his horse first. The animal fought the reins, nostrils flared wide, trying to pull away from the noise and flashes. Powers grabbed the saddle horn and put one boot in the stirrup. Before he could swing into the seat, shots from Isham's side of the square reached him even inside the alley. Heavy bullets from Winchesters smashed into his back and side. He dropped against the horse, arms flung wide, then slid down to the dirt beside the animal's legs. The frightened horse lunged, jerking the reins against the post while Powers lay still at its feet. Marshal Connolly came through the livery and into the alley from the west with his rifle in his hands, intent on reaching the plaza. Powder smoke hung in layers and noise from the square bounced between the walls, making direction hard to judge. He saw Powers lying near the horse line and moved toward the fallen man, bending over him, trying to see if the outlaw still lived or could be disarmed. In that instant, his attention fixed on the body at his feet, not on the shadows under the oil tank. Grant lay there, pressed against the dirt and iron, using the tank as a shield from the fire pouring in from Isham's. When he saw Connolly stop over Powers with his back turned, Grant raised his Winchester and fired once. The bullet hit the marshal in the back and drove through his chest. Connolly collapsed forward across Powers' body without a sound, his rifle dropping from his hands into the dust. In the space of a few heartbeats, the town's law officer and one of the raiders lay together at the foot of the same horse, both down in the alley that would carry their names and stories ever after. Cloer, still near the stable doorway, saw the muzzle flash from under the tank and understood at once what had happened. He brought his rifle to his shoulder and searched for Grat's outline in the mix of shadow and smoke. While he lined his sights, bullets from the square continued to tear into the posts and sheds along the opposite side. Horses screamed and kicked at the boards. Dirt spat up in small puffs where rounds struck low. In the middle of that confusion, Grat shifted to look over Connolly's fallen form, exposing his throat and jawline out from behind the tank's curve. Cloer fired. His rifle bucked against his shoulder and the slug cut into Grat's neck. The outlaw jerked backward, weapon falling from his grip, blood spreading in a sudden dark wash across his shirt. He sagged at the base of the tank and did not move again. Marshal Connolly lay face down only a few feet away. The man who had guided Coffeyville's response and the brother who had once carried a federal badge in Indian Territory now shared the same patch of dust in the back of the town where both had lived and worked. At roughly the same time, Broadwell fought his way to his horse. Wounds from the fire that had raked the Condon Bank and the dash across Walnut Street already slowed him. He grabbed the saddle horn and hauled himself into the seat with a grim set to his mouth. As he straightened, Cloer turned his rifle on him and fired again. The bullet struck Broadwell, driving into him as the horse surged forward. Seaman stepped around an outbuilding with his shotgun lifted and triggered a blast of buckshot into the outlaw's back as he rode past. Lead pellets tore into flesh and cloth, but Broadwell clamped his legs on the horse's sides and forced the animal into a run, leaving a splatter of blood on the alley dirt as he pushed toward the open country beyond town. Inside the tightening ring of fire, Bob and Emmett had reached the point where their own horses stood tied. Bob kept his Winchester moving, working the lever and snapping shots toward the line of muzzles visible at the mouth of the alley, even as he grabbed for his animal's reins. Rounds from Isham's front and upper windows chased him, the hardware store volunteers sending steady fire into the gap between the jail and the livery sheds. One of those bullets struck home, hitting Bob in the head and driving him off balance. Another entered his body and punched deep into his chest. He dropped against a stack of curbstones stored near the jail wall, landing half-seated against the piled stone with his rifle still in his hands. For a moment he stayed there, breathing in shallow pulls, eyes fixed on the line of horses ahead. Blood darkened his coat and dust clung to the side of his face where he had hit the ground. The impact that would have kept many men still did not hold him down. He forced himself upright, pushed away from the curbstones, and staggered a few steps toward the livery line, raising his Winchester again as he tried to bring the muzzle to bear on Cloer, who had just killed Grat and was working the bolt on his rifle for another shot. Cloer saw him coming. The liveryman had known the Daltons as horsemen and customers in earlier years. Now he saw Bob's coat soaked at the chest and his eyes still fixed with a determination that ignored the damage already done. He shouldered the rifle once more, found the center of Bob's chest in his sights, and fired. The slug hit squarely. Bob jerked as if struck with a hammer and fell backward onto the hard ground, the Winchester slipping from his grasp. This time he did not rise. His body lay near the curbstones, boots slightly askew, hat rolled a short distance away where it had bounced along the alley dirt. Emmett pulled himself into the saddle of his own horse while this killing unfolded. Until that point, he had escaped serious injury, though bullets had snapped close on all sides and glass and splinters had grazed him through the fight at the bank. He gripped the reins in one hand and clutched the money sack with the other, urging the horse forward. Shots from the square and from the livery side continued to chew into the fence posts and the dust around him. One bullet hit his right arm, another slammed into his hip and groin, and smaller pellets from buckshot tore into his back and side, yet he remained seated, jaw clenched, pushing the animal toward the alley's mouth. Blood ran down his sleeve and pooled under his coat, soaking into his waistband. Every jolt from the horse's movement sent knives of pain along his ribs and spine. Still, when he saw Bob lying near the curbstones, he wheeled the horse and rode toward his brother rather than away from the town. He slid one leg free and leaned from the saddle, reaching down with his wounded arm, trying to drag Bob's limp weight up across the horse's withers. Bob's head rolled toward him, eyes already glazing. In a rough whisper that carried only a few feet above the noise of battle, he told Emmett that it was no use. Citizens on the hardware side saw the younger brother turn back into the alley instead of fleeing. They saw him leaning low from the horse, money sack still hanging, blood clearly visible on his coat. Several men fired at once. A blast of buckshot from Seaman's shotgun struck Emmett in the back and legs. Other rounds from rifles along the square line hit him through the shoulder and side. His grip on the reins failed. The force of the impacts lifted him out of the saddle. He toppled sideways and crashed to the dirt beside Bob, rolled once and came to rest flat on his back, the money sack falling from his grasp and spilling currency into the dust. For a short span of seconds, some men around the square kept firing into the alley, not yet sure who among the gang still moved. Bullets struck the bodies already lying on the ground, kicking up more dust and cutting fresh tears in cloth. One slug grazed Emmett's face. Another passed through muscles already torn by shot. He lay with his chest heaving, lungs pulling in air through a mouth filled with the taste of iron and grit. The weight of his clothing, soaked with blood, seemed to pin him more firmly than any hand could have done. The fire tapered as voices rose, shouting for a halt. Men in Isham's doorway, Boswell's front, and at the corners near the jail called out that the outlaws were down. Clower kept his rifle leveled on the alley while he advanced one careful step at a time, watching for any twitch that might signal a hand reaching for a gun. Seaman reloaded his shotgun with practiced motions but held his fire. Other citizens moved in along the fence line from both ends, using posts and outbuildings for cover until they were close enough to see the scene clearly. When they reached Powers's body near the horse line, they found the marshal sprawled across him, both men dead. Grant lay crumpled beneath the oil tank, eyes open and fixed on nothing, the wound in his throat still seeping slowly into the dirt. A few yards away, Bob lay on his back near the curbstones, chest and head ruined by the rounds that had brought him down. Emmett remained the only man in outlaw clothing who still breathed. His hat lay beside him, his hair matted with blood. His right arm lay twisted at an unnatural angle across his chest. His boots were streaked with red mud where dust and blood had mixed together underfoot. A citizen stepped forward to strip the revolver from Emmett's belt. As he bent down, Emmett's left hand jerked toward his own gun, instinct still pushing him to defend himself even as his strength faded. Another shot rang out from somewhere at the edge of the alley, striking him again and forcing his arm back to the ground. The man taking the weapon cursed the unnecessary extra wound and shouted for everyone to hold their fire. After that, no one else pressed a trigger. Rifles remained trained on the fallen outlaw, while several men knelt beside him and checked for additional weapons, then rolled him gently enough to see the extent of his injuries. They found torn flesh along his right arm, wounds in his hip and groin, and buckshot scattered across his back and side. Blood covered his shirt front and pooled in the hollows of his collarbones. Bruising already darkened skin around the worst injuries. When they tried to lift him, he cried out despite his efforts to stay silent, then slipped toward unconsciousness as the strain pushed even his stubborn will beyond its limit. The men who held him exchanged glances, aware that they were looking at the youngest of the brothers who had come to rob their town and the only one whose chest still rose in ragged breaths. Beyond the alley, the sound of shooting faded into low voices and the distant clatter of dropped cartridge cases colliding with boardwalks. Men stepped out from doorways, rifles still in hand, and stared toward the narrow passage where smoke still drifted between the buildings. Women who had waited in the shelter of back rooms and side streets peered out, catching sight of bodies on the ground and horses trembling in their traces. The center of Coffeyville's business district, which had stood in orderly calm at sunrise, now sat ringed with shattered glass, splintered wood, dead animals in their harness, and the sprawled forms of men from both sides of the fight. In the cramped space that would carry the name Death Alley, citizens and officials began to sort the living from the dead. Connolly lay still under the weight of his own rifle. Powers and Great had already gone beyond any help. Bob, who had planned the raid and driven it forward, lay motionless as men stepped past to reach his brother. Emmett, barely conscious and marked by more wounds than anyone around him could easily count, was lifted carefully by several pairs of hands and carried away from the alley toward a more secure place. The running fight through Coffeyville had ended in that cluttered lane behind the banks, leaving the town and the surviving outlaw to face what would come after the gun smoke cleared, within minutes after the last shots faded in the alley behind the banks. The square in Coffeyville filled with people who had stayed inside during the gunfire. Men who had fired from doorways stepped out with rifles still in their hands. Women came from back rooms and side streets, skirts brushing broken glass and splinters on the boardwalks. Children looked from behind their mothers' skirts toward the banks in the alley, catching glimpses of bodies, wounded horses, and men with blood on their clothes. The town that had started the morning in routine business now stood in stunned silence, punctuated by the low sounds of wounded men and animals. Marshal Charles Connolly's body lay in the alley, partly across Bill Powers. The first men to reach him, including John Clore, rolled him gently onto his back and saw that his chest did not rise. They removed his hat and set it beside him. Rifles leaned against the jail wall while citizens who had just risked their lives uncovered their heads and bowed around the fallen marshal. There had been no formal order when the Daltons rode in. Connolly had turned a loose group of townsmen into a fighting line in minutes, and now his body lay among those of the very men he had sought to stop. On the ground nearby, Bob and Grat Dalton lay still with their faces turned toward the sky. Bill Powers' body remained near the struggling horses. Dust around each of them showed dark stains where blood had soaked into the ground. Their coats, chosen with care to pass for town wear, were torn and cut. Revolvers and Winchesters lay scattered where they had fallen when hands loosened. Citizens moved in cautiously, kicked loose weapons away, and gathered them into piles. False whiskers and fragments of wigs lay mixed with broken glass and spilled currency near the spots where the gang had made its last stand. Emmett Dalton lay alive among the dead, barely conscious and covered in blood. When citizens turned him over, they counted wounds on his arms, hips, legs, and back. Each mark a small crater edged with torn cloth and skin. Shot from rifles and buckshot from a shotgun had passed through his body from several angles. Rough estimates put the number of wound tracks in the dozens. Breath came in sharp gasps, and his eyes opened only in brief slits. Some men wanted him finished on the spot, pointing to the bodies of Connolly, George Cubine, Charles Brown, and Lucius Baldwin as reason enough. Others insisted that the law must take its course now that he lay unable to fight. A doctor and several citizens carried Emmett from the alley to a nearby building used as a temporary surgery. They laid him on a table and cut away his jacket and shirt. Bullet and buckshot wounds in his right arm, hip, and groin bled freely. Smaller pellets had peppered his back and side. The doctor worked with forceps and probes, removing what he could, while townsmen held Emmett's arms and shoulders to keep him from jerking under the pain. He drifted, in and out of awareness, sometimes muttering brief answers when asked his name, sometimes silent with his jaw clenched and his face pale. Outside, searchers saddled fresh horses and rode out along the western roads. Broadwell had left the alley mounted, trails of blood marking his path. Farmers on the outskirts had seen a man hunched low over a horse's neck and shouted the news as riders passed. A party followed the sign westward. A short distance from town they found a riderless horse blowing hard near a fence, and a little further on the body of a man stretched on the ground. Wounds from rifle fire and buckshot had taken their full effect. The clothing and features matched the description of Dick Broadwell. His remains were lifted into a wagon and brought back to Coffeyville so that the entire gang lay at last within the town's reach. By afternoon, the bodies of the 4 dead outlaws lay on display. Town officials decided to bring them together where citizens could see for themselves that the men who had ridden in with rifles and grain sacks now posed no further threat. Coffins had not yet been built, so the bodies were arranged side by side in a plain space near the jail, boots still on their feet. People filed past in a slow line. Some stared without speaking. Others pointed out details in a hard tone, bullet holes in coats, the features of men whose names had appeared in newspapers as train robbers, the loose hair where false beards had fallen away. Children stood on tiptoe to look over the shoulders of adults. Photographers in the region understood the importance of what had happened. A camera was brought in. The 4 outlaws were positioned against a bare wall, their hats removed, their hands folded. The image that resulted would travel far beyond Coffeyville, showing the Dalton brothers and their companions stiff in death, tied together with a rope for the picture so that no one could mistake them for living prisoners. That photograph, reproduced in papers and on postcards, fixed to public view the end of the gang that had shaken railroad lines across Indian Territory. While citizens satisfied themselves that the outlaws would not return, attention turned to honoring the local dead. Connolly's body was carried to a quiet room where his family and friends gathered. His badge lay on the table beside him, its metal dulled by dust and smoke. Men who had served under him or alongside him in earlier disturbances came in with their hats in their hands. They remembered a marshal who knew the names of nearly everyone in town, who had broken up fights in saloons with firm words rather than gunplay when he could, and who had been first to run toward the banks that morning. The bodies of George Cubine and Charles Brown were brought in from Union Street. They had gone out as neighbors with a single rifle between them and had fallen close together. Now they lay side by side once more. Their families stood nearby, faces set in a grief that did not need words. Lucius Baldwin, the young man who had walked into the line of fire behind First National, lay in another room. His relatives and friends formed a small circle where murmured comfort replaced the loud voices that had filled the square earlier in the day. Coffeyville, in only a few hours, had lost men from its law, trade, and younger generation. Evening fell over a town that smelled of smoke, blood, and spent powder. Lanterns burned late in homes and businesses as people spoke through the details of the day. Children who had watched men firing from windows now lay in bed listening as their parents explained which neighbors would not be coming back. On the square, men gathered with brooms and shovels. They cleared broken glass from boardwalks, pulled dead horses from harness, and righted toppled barrels and crates. Bullet scars on brick and stone remained as they were. No one suggested smoothing those away. The marks felt like part of the truth that had taken shape in front of every eye that morning. The next day, Coffeyville began its formal acts of mourning. Funerals followed in close order. Connolly's service drew a full church. His coffin sat at the front, draped in fabric, with his badge placed upon it. Men in suit coats and women in plain dresses filled the pews. Ministers spoke on duty, sacrifice, and the responsibility of communities to stand against lawlessness. Outside, a line of citizens extending along the street waited to follow the cortege to the cemetery. When the procession moved, rifle muzzles rested on shoulders in a silent escort for the marshal who had met the gang in the line of his work. Cubine and Brown, neighbors in life and in their last moments in front of the drugstore, were buried with equal respect. Merchants and tradesmen closed their shops to attend. Friends carried the coffins from the church to the wagons that would take them to burial. Tears and clenched jaws marked the faces of those who walked behind. For Baldwin, the funeral bore a different tone, the sorrow that attends a young man who stepped forward in a dangerous moment and paid with his life. Each grave in the Coffeyville cemetery that received one of these defenders became a place where widows, parents, and children would stand in the years to come and look back toward the town that had called their men into harm's way. Arrangements for the outlaws' burials took longer. Families of some of the dead lived in other states and territories. For a time, their bodies remained under guard, both for legal reasons and to prevent any act of vengeance or mutilation from those who had lost friends in the fight. In the end, coffins were made and graves prepared. 3 of the dead, including Bob and Grat, were laid in plots at Coffeyville's cemetery. Dick Broadwell's remains were eventually claimed and taken to his family. The town allowed the burials to proceed without public ceremony, intent on closing that part of the chapter quietly while keeping its full attention on the memory of the defenders. In the weeks that followed, official inquiries documented the raid in detail. Coroner's inquests took testimony from bank employees, hardware store owners, customers, and dozens of citizens who had fired or taken cover. Each witness described where he had stood, what he had seen, and when he had pulled the trigger. Doctors gave their findings on the wounds of the dead, specifying entry paths and causes of death for both citizens and outlaws. The record fixed times, distances, and positions that later writers would return to again and again in accounts of the day. From the first, those records and the stories that spread by word of mouth stressed the speed and force of the citizen response. Newspapers across the region printed detailed accounts that praised Coffeyville's willingness to meet the gang with whatever weapons lay nearest. Comparisons to earlier famous events appeared, particularly to the Northfield defense in Minnesota, where townspeople had confronted the James Younger gang. The names of Connolly, Cubine, Brown, and Baldwin took their place alongside other citizens who had met heavily armed raiders in broad daylight with rifles drawn from behind store counters and home doors. Emmett Dalton's path during those same weeks led from the makeshift surgery to a jail cell. Doctors did not expect him to live through the first days. Wounds in his arm, hip, and lower body carried a constant risk of infection in an era before modern antibiotics. For a time, he remained under close watch in Coffeyville, guarded by men who remembered seeing him ride into town at the head of the column, and who had seen friends fall under his brother's gun. Gradually, the bleeding slowed and fever stayed within a range the doctor believed he could survive. Once he could be moved, deputies placed him on a stretcher and carried him under guard to a stronger jail in Independence, Kansas. There, in a cell whose barred window looked onto a small yard rather than open range, Emmett learned that he alone would face trial for the raid. Charges included robbery and the killing of Marshall Connolly. Attorneys met with him through the bars or in a small office, speaking quietly on possible outcomes. The weight of public feeling left little room for leniency. The state intended to show that even a surviving younger brother whose body still bore scores of scars could be held to account in court for what had taken place in Coffeyville's streets. When he was strong enough to sit through proceedings, he appeared in a Kansas courtroom. Spectators filled every bench. Some had lost relatives in the raid. Others came who had armed themselves in response to earlier train robberies and wanted to see the law complete what the town had begun. Bank officers from Coffeyville took the stand. They described how Emmett and his brother had forced them at gunpoint to fill grain sacks with currency, how employees and customers had been driven ahead of rifles into the street, and how nearby citizens had been shot when they tried to resist. The jury heard how Connolly, Cubine, Brown, and Baldwin had died in the line of defense. They heard how a surviving outlaw had been found among the dead and had tried even then to draw his revolver when citizens moved in to disarm him. Defense arguments on his youth, his wounds, and his earlier service as a deputy marshal in Indian Territory did not change the overall tone in the room. The court found him guilty and the judge pronounced a life sentence in the Kansas State Penitentiary. Emmett left the courthouse in shackles, loaded into a wagon that would take him to the rail line and from there to the stone walls at Lansing. Prison life marked a sharp break from the open camps and outlaw trails that had filled his earlier years. Within the high walls at Lansing, Emmett wore striped clothing and followed a strict schedule. Guards with rifles watched galleries and yards. Inmates worked in shops and yards under close supervision. Letters came on paper that carried the smell of home kitchens and family hands. Visitors appeared behind screens in narrow rooms. Outside, trains still crossed the plains and lawmen still rode over the old trails. But for him, the world had shrunk to cells, corridors, and the grind of labor within the penitentiary. Years passed in that routine. The gunfight at Coffeyville did not fade from public memory. Newspapers revisited it whenever other robberies occurred. Writers compared new cases to the Daltons' last raid and highlighted the role of armed citizens and determined local officers. The photograph of the 4 dead outlaws remained in circulation. Travelers carried copies to other towns where they passed from hand to hand as proof that the most daring gang in the region had met its end at the hands of merchants, farmers, and a city marshal. After more than a decade in prison, Emmett's circumstances changed again. His conduct record behind the walls remained steady, and petitions reached the governor of Kansas from citizens who believed that enough years had passed for mercy to be considered. Families of the Coffeyville dead did not all agree, but voices calling for a conditional release grew slowly more numerous. In the end, the governor granted parole. Emmett walked out of the penitentiary gates after 14 years with scars all along his body, gray showing in his hair, and a future that held no place for a return to armed robbery. He did not take up the gun again. In the years after his release, he worked at ordinary trades, including building and real estate, and eventually moved west. He married, built a home life, and wrote on his experiences. His accounts of the gang's rise and fall appeared first in magazine pieces and later in book form. He told of train robberies and the Coffeyville raid in plain language, acknowledging the choices that had led him and his brothers from deputy work to outlawry, and then to the alley behind the banks. On more than one occasion, he returned to Kansas as an older man and walked once more past the buildings where the fighting had taken place. Coffeyville itself turned the events of October 5th into a permanent part of its landscape. The Condon Bank building survived and continued in use, its brick front still marked in places by bullet scars from the fight. The alley behind the banks gained the name Death Alley, a label that appeared in guides, on maps, and in the speech of local residents. A museum emerged that collected weapons, photographs, and documents from the raid. Visitors could see the battered rifles used by citizens, the grain sack that had once carried bank money, and the image of the 4 outlaws laid side by side after the fight. A monument called the Dalton Defenders Memorial rose in town. Carved stone listed the names of Connolly, Cubine, Brown, and Baldwin and marked the spot where citizens had stood against the gang. Each year, commemorations brought townspeople and visitors together to remember the fight. Children learned the names in school books and from elders who had walked the square as young witnesses. The story became part of Coffeyville's identity, a constant reminder of what a small town could do against hardened men who believed that rifles and surprise would prove enough. Beyond Coffeyville, the raid's outcome helped shape how later outlaws and lawmen thought about the changing West. Train robbers and bank raiders understood that towns near rail lines could no longer be treated as passive backdrops. Hardware stores and homes held more firearms than ever before. Telegraph wires and later telephone lines tied communities together so that alarms traveled quickly. The image of the Dalton raid in Kansas, like the Northfield defense years earlier, stood as an example that gangs could be stopped not only by organized posses, but by ordinary citizens acting in concert with their marshal. In the broader frontier, the early 1890s marked the waning of the era in which small bands of armed riders could count on distance and slow communication as shields. Indian territory moved toward statehood. Federal courts, territorial marshals, and local sheriffs tightened their cooperation. Railroad detectives and private agencies expanded their reach. As towns grew and the countryside filled with more farms and ranches, places where gangs could hide shrank. Within that context, the failed attempt to rob both Coffeyville banks in one morning stood as a clear line between an older style of outlawry and a new order in which such raids carried a high chance of ending in fast and fatal confrontation. Decades after the last member of the gang died, the story remained vivid. Visitors walked the square in Coffeyville, tracing in their minds the path the 5 riders took from the alley to the bank doors and back again. Guides pointed to bullet marks on stone, to the site of the livery, to the spot where the marshal fell. In quiet moments at the cemetery, names on headstones connected those scenes to the real lives ended there, both outlaw and defender. The town that had once known the Dalton brothers as boys and young men had faced them in their most dangerous form, and had paid in blood to stop them. The memory of that choice, fixed in stone, photographs, and living stories, marked a turning point in the history of the Old West.